Okay. So, good morning, and thank you all so much for joining us. Welcome to the beautiful DC Water headquarters that we affectionately refer to as HQO. We certainly must thank the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments for hosting this regional summit on PFAS. My name is Kirsten Williams. I'm the Chief Communications and Stakeholder Engagement Officer in EDP. And thankfully, we had a little bit of time to revise our agenda, but I am standing in the stead of David Gaddis, who is our CEO and General Manager. He certainly wanted to be here today to welcome you to our headquarters in this important conversation. But with all things, we know we have a boss. And in this regard, our boss, Mayor Muriel Bowser, is doing her budget this morning before the DC Council. And Mr. Gaddis was summoned to attend along with the other agency directors and leads. So he did have a valid excuse today for not being here. But I just want to begin by thanking a few individuals who really have been spearheading not just this event, but certainly the regional consensus that we have tried to adhere to on this really important topic. So Steve Bieber, thank you so much for the Council of Governments, who's the president, for hosting us today. Lisa Reagan, we would be remiss if we did not thank you for all that you do. She's not just a subject matter expert, but she really does know how to herd cats effectively, and she gets us all together on numerous calls to talk through these topics. Certainly last but not least, members of the DC Water team who have been instrumental in putting this together in coordination with COG. John Lyle, Pamela Mooring, Morris Nuama, Scott Ellenwood, and Emmanuel Briggs have just been really troopers in doing this and orchestrating it. So I have to thank them as well. So we have a full agenda that is going to be an analysis from both international experts, regional experts, leading experts on this topic. We know these important conversations are certainly invaluable to helping us navigate the PFAS regulatory lens, and certainly from my perspective, ensuring that our community and our stakeholders have a good awareness of what this topic is and how we're treading those waters, pun intended. So we hope today that you'll leave the summit with a committed collaboration and certainly a closer to a more cohesive regional approach. And I think we've started that today, again, in great partnership with COG. As you all know, the water industry is facing several new and growing threats to our drinking water and our communities. In addition to our aging infrastructure, accelerating climate change, our lead service line replacements, microplastics, we must also now address contamination from PFAS or other forever chemicals. These chemicals are commonly found in treated products such as our nonstick cookware, firefighting foam, clothing products, food packaging, household dust, and now our water as well. There's a lot of testing and recent emerging science on PFAS, and it's important that collectively we are all informed and are working from shared knowledge on this topic. That's what today is truly all about. We are going to dive right into our topic and certainly don't want to belabor too much. So I have the pleasure of getting this started with introducing Penny Gross, who has served on the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors since November of 1995 and also represents Fairfax County on the Board of Directors of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. So she's no stranger to COG. So please join me now in welcoming Penny Gross to the podium. As she is coming, I would be remiss if I did not take what we call a healthy, safe, and well moment. And for the utility folks, it's the safety moment. So just for your awareness, we are asking that you silent your phones today so that our individuals who are streaming virtually don't have any disruptions. We're also asking that if there's an emergency, you exit out of these doors. There are two doors in the front and the back. And our bathrooms are also located out of the back door to the left. So that's my healthy, safe, and well moment this morning. And I will turn it over to Ms. Gross. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. Good morning. This looks like church. I think all of you need to actually come up. We've got all these seats up in front. And so please, as the seminar goes on, please come up front. You know, I have been at events at DC Water in the past, but it wasn't like this. I'm thinking of Dorothy. Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. This is absolutely glorious building. And the growth around DC Water is enormous. Stunning what has happened over the last 10 or 15 years in this area to really make this portion of Washington, D.C. fully successful and very vibrant. I was amazed at the number of people getting off the metro as I was idling there at that corner. I thought I was in Tyson's Corner. I thought I was in downtown Washington. It was really remarkable. I am so glad that my entreaties to do another water summit like we did in 1999 have resulted in a year-long series of seminars. I think that this will be, today will be very, very interesting, but all of the seminars that are being handled will give us a much better sense of where we are with our extraordinary growth in the metropolitan region. I've been working on water issues as an elected official for about 25 years. At first, it seemed fairly simple, restoring the Chesapeake Bay and our local streams and getting recognition of local governments and their responsibilities in the C2K agreement way back in 2000. Then we were concerned about water quantity and water quality in our growing region. In 1999, the regional drought brought into keener focus the need for local jurisdictions to work collaboratively rather than adversarially, and the co-ops led the way. And I must say, for many of us in elective office, we were not aware of the foundation that the co-ops had already established years and years before. And so a special shout out to ICPRB, to my own Fairfax Water, and all the public utilities here today. You have established a foundation decades ago that is serving us very, very well today. Later, we learned about endocrine disruptors and then the chemical pollution caused by spills in West Virginia and rural Maryland. Several years ago, we started hearing about PFAS, or poly and perfluoroalkyl substances. At least endocrine disruptors is easier to pronounce. I first learned about PFAS in greater detail at the National Association of Counties Environment, Energy, and Land Use Committee meetings. I serve as vice chair there. When Rob Zappel, a North Carolina commissioner, raised an issue that was creating havoc in his coastal county. The culprit then appeared to be a military installation. So if you didn't have military installations in your local jurisdictions, why worry? For a couple of years, Rob was a lone voice at NACO, but gradually other counties took notice, and PFAS is recognized as the danger it is across the country. In the realm of It's a Small World, I discovered that Commissioner Zappel actually grew up in my district in Fairfax County, and we've bonded over that and PFAS. In February, NACO's EELU committee focused part of its winter legislative agenda on PFAS, including a presentation from the Department of Defense. As I understand it, in that presentation, DoD has advised its installations that they cannot buy PFAS after this year. I think it's October of this year, but they don't have to stop using it until their supplies are exhausted. Earlier this month, EPA released a proposed national primary drinking water regulation for PFAS and related substances. While this is an important step in the right direction, localities need to pay close attention to the limits of science and technology that our utilities always are struggling to meet, and take costs into account. It is well worth reminding decision makers that utility ratepayers are taxpayers, so cost-benefit analyses will be critical to future decisions. Water is a precious resource shared by all. Its protection is up to all of us, too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So next we are going to have a presentation by Dr. Rosa Gwynn with AECOM. And I do believe that we have some bios, and if not, Dr. Gwynn has certainly no stranger to this topic and is truly an international subject matter expert. She, about a year ago, conducted a presentation for us, and I have to tell a little teaser that I didn't know if she was going to share it, so I was taking screenshots because it was so informative and put in such simplistic terms that I was, copiously taking notes and screenshotting so I could make sure I captured the information that she was sharing. So you are certainly in for a treat today to have an opportunity to hear from her firsthand and certainly to engage her with questions. So Dr. Gwynn, thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. If you're not going to sit in the front row, I'm going to approach you. So we're going to talk about PFAS today. I say PFAS, rhymes with jackass, because there is actually confusion about some of the terminology, and words matter. So and for you, PFAS is easier than per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, so we do have that. Okay, so if you can, do you have a clicker, or do you want me to? Okay, affectionately known as the clicker. Let's see. Right. Okay, so we're just going to set the stage a little bit, and I don't want to steal any thunder from the later presenters who are subject matter experts in their own right. But I have learned that if you're new to PFAS and you've heard a few things a little bit, it actually helps to hear them again and again, right? Because things are changing, the ways people talk about PFAS are changing. So forgive me already, other panelists, if I say some things that you were going to address, or maybe say them the wrong way. But I think repetition might be kind of valuable and will help us come up with some questions later, especially if you've heard some conflicting things. So PFAS, we have to write it out just so people, can take that away. We're going to talk a little bit about PFAS characteristics, where they occur, quite a one water perspective about PFAS. That's, after all, really the core issue, not just for today, but generally surrounding PFAS. And yes, I am going to do a little bit of chemistry today, so sorry about that. I'm not going to talk through the federal actions, but there certainly have been some interesting developments and some things to keep an eye on. We want to talk a little bit about PFAS behavior in wastewater, because that's certainly one of the topics that's kind of come forth. We've been treating PFAS in drinking water for over 20 years in this country, right? So that's a little bit old hat. And then maybe some notional discussion items about breaking the cycle, not answers, but just kind of a concept that you can work with. So, okay, lots of little tiny words on here, but highlighting with the green maybe helps wade through the morass. Starting in the upper left, what are PFAS? What are they? Well, we already said they're per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. In fact, I'm going to go back. These are two perfluorinated alkyl substances on the screen. Little graph on the right, you might remember from your high school chemistry. No need to panic. The chain, it means, the alkyl means chain. That's what that chain is. And chains can take different shapes. They can bend and they can branch. And polyfluoro means every carbon, those are the gray balls, is connected entirely to fluorines, with the exception of this kind of alien probe thing at the end. That's a functional group. So perfluoro means every carbon has all of its hydrogens removed replaced with fluorine. And poly means some, and that means that if you were to redraw this, you'd take some of those blue balls off, those blue balls are the fluorine, and replace them with hydrogens. Okay, and these are two known actors in the PFAS world, and one of the reasons I say PFAS is because we have this compound known as PFAS, and so we don't want to get those two mixed up. That's a specific compound. That's what it looks like. PFAS is this big general group, and PFOA is another known entity in the PFAS universe, and it's one that's certainly going to come up in our discussions today, I would hope. Back to this, PFAS characteristics. So I showed you a couple PFAS, but there are actually thousands of these. Why? Because they're synthetic. None of them occur in nature. Well, you know, that's something you have to look out for. When people say PFAS are statement, they're liars, because PFAS are very complicated. Nothing is entirely true for PFAS any more than it's true for all human beings are ... right? So, but the fact that they're synthetic, not man-made, actually many of the original manufacturing sites were powered by women, which is how we learned some of the health effects. So they're synthetic compounds. So, you know, the creativity of the human chemist is boundless. We can make as many PFAS as we'd like to do. But there are about 10,000 that are known to have been synthesized, and there are far fewer, maybe hundreds, that have been used commercially. What makes them so attractive is many PFAS, not all PFAS, many PFAS are highly resistant to thermal, chemical, and biological degradation. That's terrific. So you make a compound and you don't have to worry about it falling apart. This is great for manufacturing. They also act as surfactants. They keep things apart. Like think about waterproofing on your boots. You know those little beads that form? That's because of PFAS. Same with your Gore-Tex jacket. Same with the eggs not sticking to your Teflon pan. That's all surfactant properties. But those surfactant properties are also super important in a ton of industrial applications, not including or limited to the use of aqueous film forming foam, which is a surfactant foam. So we see all these broad commercial applications, and we have merrily gone through our lives enjoying the benefits of PFAS in all of these applications. It's terrific, right? So now we realize, okay, wait a minute, these things are pretty stable. In fact, that carbon-fluorine bond is the strongest, one of the strongest covalent bonds, right? They don't want to be pulled apart. They don't want to be pulled apart. So it takes energy to create them, and it takes energy to break them, and a lot of energy. Because many PFAS have a very high mobility because they're not sticking to things, they're all over the place. You'll hear people say PFAS are everywhere. They're actually not everywhere. We've taken lots of samples that have no PFAS in them. What the real statement I like to use is PFAS are in a lot of places they shouldn't be. And they are at the North Pole, and they are in polar bear blood, and they are, actually, I had my blood tested this last month. They're my blood. So, you know, they're in a lot of places they shouldn't be. So there's this extreme mobility once they enter into water. And for some PFAS, we have known toxicity, really good tox data for about, well, at least 6, right? At least 6, but about 9 of them. So, but there are thousands of them. You know, that in itself is a burden to society to have to figure out this toxicity. And we already talked about destruction. So why is there this urgency around PFAS? Well, I sort of joke, nobody wants anything in their drinking water other than H2O, right? That's what people are thinking this. I mean, we've had other things in our water all the time. In fact, some of them are essential human nutrients and we have to have them, right? We're grateful for it. But some things don't belong in drinking water, and especially at low concentrations, you need to guard against public health concerns, right? So that's where that's going. PFAS are indeed in the drinking water of millions of people. There's lots of data that have tested PFAS. There's some data that project where those PFAS might be. There's a recent publication in Europe on that. But people are unhappy. People are unhappy. Nobody wants to hear that because they live near a military facility that they have PFAS in their drinking water, and certainly don't want to know or believe that their health concerns are associated with that. You know, that's a worry, right? We have evaluating regulations. I make a lot of my salary just from tracking regulations. And there's a lot to talk about there. And of course, liability is an issue. You know, who's going to pay for all of this? There's some changes that really need to be made. And how are we going to manage that? So these little icons across the bottom are the way that I think about PFAS in a graphical form for those of you who might be millennials. So, okay, so where do PFAS occur? We've already talked a little bit about this. I mentioned aqueous film-forming foam, AFFF. That's another easier thing to say. Aqueous film-forming foam was used developed by the military. By the way, PFAS were discovered in the lab in the 1940s, just kind of to put it in context. In the 1960s, the US military, the Navy in particular, decided that they were going to include PFAS in their firefighting foams. Previously, they'd used protein foams, but they had a horrible accident on an aircraft carrier. There's no getting away from a fire on an aircraft carrier. 134 seamen were killed, 169 injured in that fight, and the Navy said, we need to figure something out. And you can trust me on this, AFFF has saved the lives, undoubtedly, of thousands of people. And you know, if that airplane is going down in the airfield and your grandma's on it, you're going to want them to use the good stuff, aren't you? You're going to want to save those lives, and you're also going to want to protect the firefighters. So our charge is to find a better foam, not just use a poisonous foam, but find a better foam so that we can do that. Right, so that's a little bit about what you're talking about with the Department of Defense, and they have actually instated this requirement for fluorine-free foams. So I give a list there of where foams are used. They're used at a lot more than aviation sites, so that's kind of interesting. And then, of course, we've talked about manufactured goods, these carpets, so that they don't stain or get grease, or you spill your red wine on your carpet, often had a PFAS-related coating on it. All of those things, all of those household goods end up in a landfill. And back in the day, they went into a landfill that wasn't, worried about PFAS. And so they have a way of getting to landfill leachate, and we all kind of know where landfill leachate goes. So it enters into the, universe that we live in. There are a kind of crazy variety of industrial applications of PFAS. And I often go to conferences and say, what's the craziest one you've heard of? So industrial processes, PFAS manufacturing, of course, they make them, right? There's that. But metals plating, there's some foam suppression application of PFAS. High tech uses it in componentry. We actually use PFAS. All of us who want clean energy and want electric vehicles, there's PFAS in those batteries. PFAS were used to euthanize turkey populations exposed to bird flu. It was believed to be more humane than other methods. AFFF was used, I'm sorry, and uranium enrichment, of course. So what's the rub here? So not a source of PFAS, but a place where PFAS then occur is in potable water and wastewater treatment plants. So let's talk a little bit about that one water cycle, okay? A little cartoon of the one water cycle as some people see it. And we're going to talk about PFAS sources, right? I just mentioned them, but let's think about them in physical space. It helps us think about it. Now, I'm going to make one comment. Remember that some PFAS do not degrade. What that means is once released into the environment, they act as a perfect tracer, right? They trace where the water is going. Some PFAS are a perfect tracer. So, of course, there's PFAS manufacturing, and in the course of manufacturing, there's discharge to surface water through MPDES permitting, and there's disposal in landfills, and of course, there's also air emissions, which have turned out for manufacturing sites to be a significant way that area groundwater was affected, right? So then we have aviation sites, which we've mentioned. There's not just crashes at sites, there's training. You have to train people to use AFFF. And consumer products. We all love those PFAS. We use them all the time, So then you take all that stuff, your old carpets, you throw them in the landfill, and you clean them. Everybody's so happy. But all these little yellow dots are an indication of where PFAS may have gotten away from us. So the result is that there are some impacts from PFAS. And the first one is that you may have affected groundwater or surface water. In this country, we use both for water supply. In other countries, it's actually a little bit less common for groundwater to be used. But here we are. We've got private wells, we've got public water supplies, all of which can tap into these water bodies that have PFAS in them through no fault of their own, through accident, or through just community impact. That water goes into your house, goes into your mouth, goes back into the sewer, right? And then you also, maybe you clean your carpets with one of those rented things, you dump that down your drain. All of that use, ends up in a water treatment plant. And here's the water treatment plant receiving PFAS from a whole bunch of non-point sources, right? All these households. And things like landfill leachate get sent to wastewater treatment plants and other industrial sources. Industrial sources also go to wastewater treatment plants. I said that for a reason. So, and then of course we treat that water. We have biosolids as a byproduct, and we've really benefited from using biosolids for agricultural reuse since the 70s. It actually transformed how the U.S. produced food. There is tremendous benefit in the biosolids. It's what our grandmother and great grandmother and whoever always did in their application, cavemen, right? So yeah, it's a good idea to be able to use biosolids, but the result is in some places those biosolids and or the water at a farm, I'm just going to say farm, may have PFAS in it, and that could enter into livestock or possibly into the food that we eat or the food that animals eat. So we've got a real concern about this PFAS one water cycle, right? So once it gets in there, it goes around and it touches us. So, scared yet? Okay. I want to talk a little bit about PFAS complexity, right? So please don't say PFAS are ... They are not a monolith. PFAS have a great variety in chemistry. But there are a few terms that are kind of nice to know and a few things to think about that I believe this completely ridiculous graphic is helpful in conveying. Okay, so, do we have a pointer? Let's see. Oh, well, folks on the phone aren't going to be able to see this pointer, but if you start on the left, that little box represents all the PFAS that you can have in that synthetic body of chemicals. We have polymers, and there's some friends to us in there, like Teflon, right, is one of those polymers. We're not so concerned with polymers. They're kind of big. We ingest them, and then we excrete them. But we are concerned about microplastics, so stay tuned, right? So we're not concerned so much with the polymers today. We're concerned with the non-polymers. So I've helpfully highlighted across the top, really where science is thinking we need to manage PFAS. And in the non-polymers, we've already talked about the polyfluorinated and the perfluorinated, right? So you know what? This chart is not that scary. You've already been through part of it, and it wasn't harmful at all. But there's some important things. So let's just read across the top, across the perfluorinated. So we have the perfluorinated acids, and there's a whole variety pack of acids that can be made. Recently in the news, especially of interest to wastewater treatment plants, are some of these, well, actually, let me back up and let me just erase that sentence and say alkyl acids. And then as you read across the top, there's a group of carboxylic and sulfonic acids that have received a lot of attention. And what I've done is highlighted with a red box those compounds that have a draft primary drinking water standard that was just released in this country, 6 PFAS, right? So, there's a whole variety pack of PFAS here, but those are the ones that we know enough about that we know we need to manage. We've also included in that MCL, we, not me, Genax, which was supposed to be a safer replacement, and it's also in this perfluorinated family. So that's great. We can only measure about 40 PFAS, and a lot of the ones over here on the far right are among those 40 that we can reliably measure. We can only measure 40 PFAS reliably with a commercial lab. Now, of course, if you're in academics, you can do more, but we're not. So we really can only manage what we can measure. Let's keep that in mind. So Now let's focus on these things that are now highlighted in green. And what those are polyfluorinated compounds. Remember when people say PFAS don't degrade? They were liars, because polyfluorinated compounds do transform, and they will change into bad news polyfluorinated compounds, right? So it's great that you can see this transformation. And what we do know is that in water treatment plants, some of that transformation is occurring. And we also know that a lot of these so-called precursors aren't transformed. So there's a whole body of chemistry activity surrounding these poly and perfluorinated compounds that we want to be able to understand, so that we can better understand, okay, when these things end up in the universe, what's going to happen to them. That's the end of the chemistry lesson. Everybody can exhale. All right. So, but there will be a quiz at the end. The EPA helpfully put together in 2021 the strategic PFAS strategic roadmap. And I don't want to steal any thunder. I know that we have somebody speaking about regulations today, but broad brush, the 3 R's. The decision was made, we've got to restrict their use where they're not necessary, including manufacturing. By the way, PFOA and PFAS were discontinued manufacturing in the United States in the early 2000s. Restrict those PFAS that are problematic just to essential needs. And we also need to record where they're being used. Who is using these? And where are they going? And that, by the way, we do that with all sorts of chemicals. This is nothing new. Nothing new here. Right? Then research, we need to understand more, and we need to understand where they are, where they're going, what they do to us. It's a tall order to get toxicological information on 10,000 compounds. Luckily, we have computers and artificial intelligence. So I think that we are up to the challenge of, at least for the most important, most prevalent PFAS, to get a handle on, really, are they bad for us? And if they are, how bad? But that's not going to be instantaneous. There's a lot of work and research done on fate in the environment. So what if they're in biosolids? What if that never makes it to the soil? So what? So what if they don't make it into you? You don't care, right? But if they do, you do care. So fate and transport. And then remediate, clean up, things that a lot of people are going to take a little bit of time and a lot of money to deal with. But you should only clean up what you can afford and what is logical and reasonable. And that's what we've been doing for environmental issues my entire career. So let's just keep an eye on what the EPA is doing and has done. They've started monitoring a whole bunch of water, public water supplies. They did this before under the UCMR 3. They're doing it now under the UCMR 5. And the difference is that now, instead of looking for 6 PFAS, we're looking for 29. You're going to find more. And the detection limits are lower. You're going to find more. And they're looking in more utilities. Anything that serves 3,300 people or more, and then a smattering, funding allowing, of smaller utilities. We are going to find more places with PFAS. And by the way, how difficult is it going to be for you folks to explain, we have 13 PFAS in your drinking water with no known toxicity, so we will do nothing? We have to manage communications. Right. So primary drinking water standards came out last week. Someone else will address those. Those are going to be enforceable standards. The hazardous substance designation means that the folks who have released PFAS can be managed, fall under CERCLA, the Superfund Act, for the EPA to make them clean things up. Don't confuse that with hazardous waste. That's a different discussion. Surface water criteria have come out in a couple of states. And the states have done a whole bunch of stuff. That's a discussion all in itself. And the MPDS permitting is out there. And the EPA has set a goal for sometime in 2024 to finalize their risk assessment surrounding biosolids. A lot of research, and we have one of the international experts on that in the forum today. So don't worry about this chart. It just makes it a little bit less boring, although it is the result of a compilation of studies that we did with some other public studies in Michigan and California regarding the fate of PFAS in wastewater treatment plants. That's really, let me say it very simply, where we are treating water is a very convenient way to break the cycle, right? So let's look at what's happening in wastewater treatment plants. There are PFAS coming in, And almost every plant tested, actually every plant tested, PFAS were very prevalent. That's the percent detection out of about 100 wastewater treatment plants. Interestingly, the influent and effluent aren't the same. Chemistry happens. And there's also biosolids. So there's some movement from a liquid phase into this liquid plus solid in the discharge. We do know that PFAS are in a lot of wastewater treatment plants. We do know that they are dominating the aqueous phase, and it's those precursors that we talked about that are really abundant. Why? Because they're used a lot. We use those more in manufacturing as a universe of human beings because we were worried about the polyfluorinated ones. So now we have these precursors to manage. And, you know, there's a lot of attention on biosolids, but really it looks like the majority, the mass, so don't worry about concentration for a second, the total mass is in the water. The larger mass is in the water, I should say, than in the biosolids, just it's the way it works. And what Michigan did, by the way, is they said, you know what, we know that some of those industrial sources are coming into our wastewater treatment plants, and where we can identify those, we're going to have them treat. We invoked an industrial pre-treatment program. It's all out on the web. You can read the results. Super effective. Super effective. Immediate responses within the plants. So, okay. So I'm wrapping up. Hopefully timing is, oh my gosh, we're going to get so much time back. This is, you know, our old friend, this one water cycle. And I think that what we can talk through today is a discussion of how can we break that cycle? How and where can we break this perfect tracer moving around so that it doesn't end up in places it ought not be, right? So the very first thing that the governments have done, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, also in Australia, also in Canada, don't forget our friends up north, they've focused on protecting drinking water. And that's because we think we get about 80% of our PFAS exposure from drinking, we get 20% of our PFAS exposure from drinking water, 80% from other stuff. Like, you know, you eat your little lunch and you go PFAS and you carpet dust up your nose, and 80% from everything else. But the only thing we can control effectively through our societal functions is water. I don't know about only, but a really strong lever is water. So protecting drinking water, and it also protects people. And so we're happy to see that. So there's going to be some additional activities separating PFAS using some separation technologies. And there is a need for improved methods, because even with all that separation, you're going to then have the PFAS someplace else, right? You're going to have to do something with those absorptive media. I don't know if anybody is a fan of The Cat in the Hat Comes Back. It's the sequel. It's where the kids make a birthday cake and it's pink, and the cat messes it up and the pink stuff gets all over everything. Do you remember this? Okay, I didn't either, but somehow I stumbled upon it. And now I have 6 copies on my bookcase so that I can give them away, because that's the PFAS story. It's the PFAS story. So it's not good enough just to put those PFAS into GAC and then throw those into a landfill, throw that into a landfill or incinerator, whatever you might do. So we do have a need for destructive solutions, right? We want to break those bonds. And maybe not directly at drinking water, but at some phase within the cycle. We want to protect those water sources. You want to keep the stuff out of the water source to begin with. Makes it much easier to clean up. You got to intercept it where you can. In situ means right where it's at, right? You want to disrupt that discharge of PFAS. You want to disrupt it wherever it's coming. If it's from the wastewater treatment plant, maybe there's some way you can engage in that cycle of treatment, either before or after, or maybe a little bit farther upstream. Go ahead on, give it a shot. It kind of shares the work without making all the work for one entity. And I'll make one other comment. It's a lot easier to clean up a small amount of very dirty stuff than it is to clean up a large amount of not very dirty stuff. you go for the big bang, right? So we might need to manage biosolids. We certainly need to manage the concerns around biosolids and understand what's going on. And they're, just let's learn. Let's learn before we, go nuclear. And I mentioned this treatment of separated and removed PFAS-laden waste. We've got to manage the disposal of that material. And we've got to focus, I spent a lot of time on this, looking at commercially effective destruction technologies. So I'm going to leave that there. It sounds like I have left plenty of time. I hope it doesn't mean that everybody else is going to be off track. And thanks a million.
Well, that was fantastic. If we heard anything today, we know we've got to be a part of the solution to disrupt that cycle. So we heard about the PFAS challenge. Next, we're going to have the science behind the policies. And we're going to have Lisa Reagan, who is the principal water resources planner at COG. If you have any interaction with her, that means all duties as assigned and anything else that we can come up with to utilize her expertise. So Lisa, please come on
up. The one thing I do want to say is that we don't have breaks. So feel free to get up, get coffee, do a bio break, whatever you need to do, and not just sit here for the next 4 hours. I am really honored that we got a really great science panel for this, and I'm going to ask the panelists to come sit up here. We do have one remotely. So our first panelist is Dr. Joe Gicangelo, and he is the Vice President and Director of Research at Stantec. He has over 30 years of experience in the field of environmental health engineering, and he's done all areas of water. He's done one water through the full water cycle. He's done over 80 projects. He has many peer-reviewed journals. And this is my favorite fun fact, is he is the president of the American Water Works Association right now. And it's very, very exciting as an AWWA member to have a scientist be the president of AWWA. So Joe, if you want to come sit down. The next is Dr. Linda Lee, and she is on virtually. And Dr. Lee is a Purdue University distinguished professor in the Department of Agronomy and Environmental and Ecological Engineering. She works in the interdisciplinary graduate program, and she is assistant dean in the College of Agriculture. She has published many works on PFAS. The next person I'd like to introduce is Brian Mosby. If you want to come on up, Brian. Brian is the manager, division manager of biosolids and Piscataway Bioenergy. He has worked for WSSC Water for 28 years, which is pretty awesome. Hey, Brian. And he works at resource facilities throughout WSSC's service area. He's worked in engineering and had a role in facilities. He's a licensed operator and superintendent, which is always great to have the operator perspective. Brian has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Howard University. And Brian is currently the division manager for the WSSC Water first ever anaerobic digestion combined heat and power facility, or ADCHP. This facility essentially will turn poop into power.
That's right.
Next, I'd like to introduce Chris Piat from DC Water. Chris is an environmental engineer with more than 25 years of experience in wastewater treatment, residual reuse, and recycling. His work includes operations manager for 1,200 tons per day, implementation of Bloom, which is a soil amendment product. I don't know if we can say fertilizer for this one. Believe me, I've never worked in biosolids, so I didn't understand all of the finesse and nuances of like compost versus soil amendments and all of those types of issues. He's got a recognized research program and an award-winning EMS. I don't even know what EMS program is, Chris.
Environmental Management System.
Thank you. In recent years, he has focused on green energy development, carbon footprint modeling, and renewable energy credits. So we have an awesome panel today that can work and show us where the science behind all parts of the water cycle, also known as the One Water. And so I'm going to ask Dr. Chicangelo to start and take it away.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here today, and I've been asked to give a few remarks about PFAS in water before we go on to wastewater, biosolids, et cetera. And so today, I just want to talk a little bit about the sources in drinking water, the PFAS regulations, the treatment of PFAS, and then really what's it going to cost us. Some of the comments I'll make will be reflective of the three hats that I wear, whether it's as a director of research for engineering firm, whether it's an academic in my lab from my laboratory at Hopkins, or whether it's from being president of AWWA, where we represent, I think, at least 80% of the drinking water in the United States, and probably many of you in this room. So thank you for being members. So as Dr. Gwynn so ably depicted, PFAS is ubiquitous. PFAS is ubiquitous. It comes from all types of sources. I won't go over all these sources, but things like firefighting foam is one of the big sources. And then all kinds of other products that are fabricated, medical products, biocides, textiles, et cetera. So suffice it to say that it is everywhere. And it's also found in many areas of the environment. As a result of that, we have landfills where it's often found. Landfills, we find it in the milligram per liter ranges in some industrial landfills. It's as we noted, wastewater treatment plants, we find it there. Find it, of course, in biosolids, but we also find it in septic systems, home septic systems. So it is a big issue. One fun fact, 97% of Americans have PFAS in their bloodstream. So we all have it, according to a past CDC study. So we have it. It's in everything. And the way I like to depict PFAS, it's like the lead story. You know, at the turn of the century, we all thought lead was the perfect metal, right? It was malleable, it was strong, it didn't corrode. Wow, this is the way we started putting it in all our pipes because it was such a good metal, except for one thing. We found out about neurological effects. And PFAS is the same way. In the 1940s, when it was developed by DuPont, again, as we heard, it was the perfect product because why? It doesn't degrade, extremely hydrophobic. You could put everything in it, and we did. We put it everywhere, from Teflon to firefighting foams, to our saucepans, to our pizza boxes, et cetera, except for one thing. We found out there are health effects associated with many of these products, of which there are 12,000 PFAS that have been fabricated, of which a number of those, a small subset of those, we actually find in our drinking water sources. So we have many areas of the environment that we find them in, and that's how they get into the water because of either these point sources or non-point sources that we can't identify. But we know it's prevalent throughout the United States. Here we see that it's very prevalent in the East Coast areas where we are now, some of the West Coast areas, and even in the Midwest. And the number of dots on there as sources are continuing to increase as we begin to investigate further and further. So it is ubiquitous in our Bailey products, but it also seems to be almost ubiquitous in terms of the terms of where we find it in our plants throughout the country. So let me just talk about the PFAS regulations for drinking water, and it becomes very relevant. As we see in the proposed rule, there are 6 PFAS compounds of concern. And what we see here is the top 2, perfluorooctanoic acid and perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, or PFAR or PFOS. They are proposed to be regulated at about 4 nanograms per liter, 4 nanograms per liter. where we have other ones which are going to be regulated in an entirely different way, which I'll tell you in a second. But why are the two different methodologies are they being regulated? And one of the primary reasons is PFOA and PFOS, those top two, have cancer endpoints. So their MCLG, or maximum contaminant level goal, is set at 0, and the MCL is really set at about what the minimum reporting limit is. Whereas the other four, we have what's called a hazard index. I'd rather call it a health-based index, but it's a hazard index, and it's composed of those four compounds on the bottom of that table. And what you see here is that that hazard index is composed of hazard or hazard quotients, that which is in the parentheses there. So the bottom reflects their the individual levels associated with that index, and the top is the concentration that's in your drinking water, and you sum that all up and you get a hazard index. And if it's above 1, you're out of compliance. If you're below 1, you're just fine. And this is not uncommon. It's been used by the state of Minnesota, for example, for several years now. The challenge is if you have a hazard index of 0.9, you're fine, no problem. But as we find, as I said, in Minnesota, they kept adding compounds. So we went ahead and designed things to meet that hazard index, but all of a sudden, they added compounds to that hazard index, and oops, now they don't make it. So there's a real play, and hopefully that can be addressed in the future. So how much is a part per trillion? Just to give you an idea, because this is what we're measuring. We're measuring parts per trillion. And for example, a parts per trillion would be 1 drop of ink into 13,200,000 gallons of water, or 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So in my lab, when we're measuring this, you can see that we're really looking for something very, very small in a large body of water. And if you all last June, when they came out with health advisories, it was 1,000 times smaller than the regulation. So we're looking at, we can't even measure with current analytical techniques. So it's a real challenge measuring them, but also measuring them with background matrix effects in water, as well as a lot of other factors that impact that analysis. So when we get to water, why is it so difficult to destroy PFAS? Well, as we heard, it's that carbon fluorine bond. It's one of the strongest bonds in organic chemistry, and that's what makes it such a good product. When we developed it when DuPont developed it in 1940, and showed that you can't. It's very difficult to break that bond, so it was very stable. Now we can break it. We have broken it. We know how to break it, but you have to put a lot of energy into it to be able to actually break that bond. High temperatures, high pressures, et cetera, to be able to do that. So, if we have it in our water, what are our options? How do we get it out of the water? Well, there are conventional drinking water treatment methods that we currently employ really do not remove PFAS. That's the bad news. Okay, there's really what goes in, for the most part, comes out. So what do we do about treatment? We do have treatment techniques that we can employ to be able to do it. And it really depends on a whole bunch of requirements, what kind of treatment selection you actually won't go through all these, but there are several different types of considerations that must be taken into account when selecting a treatment process. But let me tell you a little bit about those treatment processes. We lost it. Can you click on to the next slide? Okay, the first one is granular activated carbon. And if you don't know what granular activated carbon is, think about when you have a barbecue and you have a charcoal briquettes in your barbecue, you mash them up into small pieces. Not exactly, but very much. granular activated carbon would be. It absorbs things onto the surface and into the interstitial pores, and that allows us to remove the compound. The major advantage is that you're concentrating the PFAS out of the water into a smaller volume on the carbon, and it's very modular and easy to deploy for small water systems. When we get to large water systems, it becomes a whole nother ballgame. The disadvantages, of course, PFAS is not destroyed, so you got to dispose of it. And we know that potentially under CERCLA, we're being asked to take out the PFAS from the water, but we may be now designated as a hazardous waste generator because we've concentrated that waste and we have to do something with it. The other advantage, it's not as efficacious when using short chain PFAS, like a 4-carbon PFAS. It's not removed as well as, for example, an 8 or 9 carbon PFAS. And the treatment efficiency is impacted by the influent water. But one thing I want to make very clear is that there's a common misperception often that, oh, hey, I've got a filter box. I got filters in my plant. I just take out that medium, put in some carbon, and I'm good to go. It won't work. It won't work. It has to be actually as a separate, what we call filter adsorb, be really efficacious to remove that. Next slide. The next technology is ion exchange. And ion exchange, if you're not familiar with it, it's a fluffy, very light material. And anyway, there's 2 mechanisms which it works. One, it can absorb onto part of that ion exchange material, but primarily PFAS, exchanging the PFAS for an ion on that material there. The technology is ready and good to go. It's primarily right now used for small utilities and primarily groundwaters. The advantage is that, again, it can concentrate the PFAS, remove it from the water. It's more effective for short chain PFAS than granular activated carbon. The disadvantage, again, PFAS is not destroyed. The ion exchange resin is site specific and requires testing. And the treatment efficacy, again, like GAC, is impacted by your influent water quality parameters. Next slide. And the last one I want to talk about is reverse osmosis or nanofiltration. We've all heard about RO. It's used for desalting ocean water, desalting water. Nanofiltration used for softening water. It's used for removal of organic materials, and it's very effective from removing PFAS from water, primarily based on size exclusion. Ionic interactions that also can occur. The key advantage, it does concentrate, again, the volume of the water into smaller volume. So that's great. However, remember that for membranes, even at the best quality water, you're still going to have about a 10% reject that you have to deal with. So 10% of your water, you're going to have a concentrated amount of PFAS. You could concentrate that down to a smaller volume with a variety of different means, but nonetheless, is a concentrate waste. And that is one of the key things why we don't use it more readily, because what we do with the waste stream. And again, it's not destroyed, removed, and it tends to be more expensive than other technologies. Next slide. Now, there are a whole number of technologies that are being developed to destroy PFAS, to break that carbon-fluorine bond and convert it into something else. I won't go through this list. They're developing. What I will make a summary comment is that for drinking water, treating the bulk flow, there's nothing that I would say is really promising. These are oriented toward very high concentrations where they can be effective. Many of these have very high energy inputs. We're getting better. We're moving on with some technologies for treating waste streams, which look very, very promising. For drinking water, again, bulk flow, nothing on the immediate horizon, although other than other innovative sorbent materials. Next slide. Okay, let me end with some cost information. This is the EPA PFAS cost estimate. If you look at the total cost, we'll just focus on that. There's two different numbers there depending on what discount interest rate you use, but it ranges somewhere between about 700 billion per year to 1.2 per year costs to water utilities. At AWWA, we also did a study, and our numbers range from about 1.9 billion to about 3.8 billion dollars per year. So on the order of 2 to 3 times more than what EPA has estimated the cost of to treat this. Last slide, please. So let me just give you an idea of an actual full-scale cost. Now, this is for drinking, this is for groundwater, not a surface water, but gives you a general idea of what some of these cost. It's for a smaller plant, 10 million gallons per day. So you can see if whether you use GAC or ion exchange on the top right, just look at the closed numbers, about 25 million for 10 MGD, okay? If we go to the annual operating cost, you can see that it's about, for GAC, it's about $1 million per year for 10 MGD, and the resins are somewhere in the $500,000 range for operating costs per year. The GAC is much more higher operating costs because of the change-out frequency, because I noted that GAC is not as effective as ion exchange for removing the short-chained PFAS compounds. So you have to change out the carbon. And the last remark I'll make is it's important to remember that with the technologies, GAC and IX, it's once through. There's no regeneration currently. So it exhausts, and then take it to incinerate or some other option. For some of the stronger wastes, there is development of some regeneration of IX, but currently not for drinking water. That's all in there.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. I just wanted to say, because I always try to check, for those of you who may not know what CERCLA is, it is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act. I actually had to look the name up because I've been calling it CERCLA for so long. The other way to think of it is the Superfund bill. So it's what drives Superfund sites, and it's also part of what RCRA, the other portion of this in CERCLA, are what can make jurisdictions themselves have increased costs, especially around disposal and solid waste disposal. On that happy note, I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Good morning, everybody. Because we had such great presenters before me, you're going to see a lot of duplicate slides in my presentation, which I'll be happy to go over. But like Dr. Gwynn said, just sometimes it's good to hear things more than once. So with that, I just want to talk about PFAS from a wastewater perspective. You can go to the next slide. PFAS is going to affect WSSC in a couple of ways. Obviously, we have water filtration plants, we have wastewater plants, and we also have a new bioenergy facility, which we're going to be treating all of our sludge through that facility. So what I wanted to do was just kind of go over each one and just kind of have a little bit of discussion about it and how it's going to affect us. So before I did that, I just want to go over the wastewater treatment process in general. WSSC has 6 water, we call them water resource recovery facilities now. And I just put up a slide of one of ours. Anytime you have a process at a plant, is generally driven by the receiving streams. So whatever the receiving stream's quality is and the quality that you're trying to achieve, you would choose a process that fits what you're going to be putting back into the stream in terms of effluent. So this is our Damascus plant. And even though it's just one plant, it kind of wraps up what we consider wastewater treatment. So the whole purpose of wastewater treatment, we're like the last line of defense when it comes to making sure we deal with our waste. So there's a couple of things we want to remove. Our wastewater plants were designed to remove suspended solids and also nutrients, and obviously sludge. Sludge was considered a waste product back then. So that's kind of the design that is currently at all of our plants. We no longer look at sludge as a waste product. We look at it as something that we can recover and reuse, and it's a resource for us now. So what this slide is just showing is a generic process flow diagram. And in the beginning, we're removing anything that can get screened. And then, of course, the biological nutrient portion of this is how we remove the nutrients. We have filtration, we have UV, and then we actually discharge. So why is this slide relevant? It's like what the two presenters said to me before, have said to all of us before. Essentially, the PFAS that comes in goes out. These plants were not designed to treat PFAS. They may come out in different forms. The majority of it comes in as liquid, but it can also go out as effluent or in our sludge. Next slide. Chris will probably recognize this slide. I think I took it from one of his presentations. But this was essentially said today. This slide just shows you the relative relationship between the PFAS and sludge, which you can see, Chris, you can confirm whether that Bloom number is correct. But you can compare that to ketchup. How many of us have eaten ketchup today or on your French fries? So it's very low when you look at exposure, but it is something that is there and we have to be concerned about. Next slide. I did not expect you to read this. Fortunately, it was already discussed in the two presentations before. WSSC Water has been monitoring PFAS coming into each one of our plants, and we've also been monitoring the effluent of what's going out, and we've been monitoring the PFAS in the sludge. This is just one of the examples of what we monitor on a continuous basis. Our most recent water resource recovery facility just had its permit renewed, and there is a requirement to monitor PFAS at this point. So things could change, but obviously it's going to affect us because of all of the facilities that we have. Slide. What's new? WSSC made a business decision that we were going to treat all of our sludge at one facility rather than have each facility treat their own sludge. And the benefit to that is that we have one treatment process and we have a reduction in the volume of the sludge through anaerobic digestion, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So this is WSSC Water's watershed, so to speak, when it comes to wastewater. You can see we have the two plants up in northern Montgomery County, and we have the 3 plants in Prince George's County. So each one of those plants are going to be sending their sludge to our bioenergy facility at Piscataway. I'm not going to get into this in great detail, but this is essentially the process. That's those of you who had DC Water, you're very familiar with this already. But this is essentially how WSSC Water is going to turn poop into power. This is the anaerobic digestion and combined heat and power process. What we're going to be doing in a nutshell is we're going to be receiving that sludge from all of the facilities, and we're going to be using the same process that's used at DC Water called CANBI. CANBI is just a process where we use high temperature and high pressure to break down the sludge before anaerobic digestion. Anaerobic digestion is the same thing that happens in your stomachs. All of you are eating snacks right now. Your stomach is going to produce methane gas from that. We're going to recover that gas and use it as energy. That gas is going to be upgraded. We have a system to upgrade the gas, and then that gas is going to actually power our generators. Those generators are going to produce electricity that we can use to power the bioenergy facility. Those generators are also going to be producing steam. That steam goes right back into the thermal hydrolysis process. And all of that, the sludge that will be produced will be thickened, and it will be considered Class A, which gives us more options for land application. So what are the benefits of that? Benefits are we're going to minimize the quality of the biosolids totally. We're going to be producing Class A, and we're going to be capturing the biogas in the processing. And then, of course, you can see on the next side of the page, it's also going to improve our power reliability, reduce our nutrient loads, and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. You can skip this slide. So as you can see, if regulations on land application are implemented to control PFAS, it's going to have a huge impact on this major project that is over $270 million for WSSC. The good news is that WSSC already has a master planning committee, and they are looking at different types of technologies right now as we speak, just in case the regulations change. We don't know exactly how they're going to change, or how they're going to impact us, but I think, Joe, you were talking about several different technologies that are already being considered. So the key is that WSSC Water is a regional leader and collaborator in sustainable biosolids management research, and we're going to continue to monitor any type of regulations that affect land application so that it doesn't affect us negatively. But we have not abandoned our original plan to produce Class A and to make sure that we're still achieving all of those benefits from the previous slide. So I think that's it. Yeah.
Our next speaker, we're going to do a panel questions at the end. So actually, if you do have questions, jot them down and we'll work through that. Our next presenter is Dr. Linda Lee, and she is at Purdue. So she will be presenting virtually. And she is going to talk more about biosolids as well. So as soon as our technology.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Lisa?
Oh, I can hear you, Doctor. Hi.
All right, I wasn't going to use biosolids, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I mean, I wasn't going to use slides, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and use a few slides. So let's make sure we have the right screen share. I unfortunately wasn't able to see any of the screen shares. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, because I couldn't see the screen shares that people were doing in the previous talks, but anyway, yeah, so let's see if we can move this along. So I just want to remind us again that, you know, the water resource recovery facilities are really just a conduit of all of our wastes. And I continually try to remind people how many things PFAS are in. People apply it to their face on a regular basis. They're applying it in their homes, their cars. So it's just that we have to deal with this problem of dealing with human wastes. So that's, you know, I always like to give that background context. And what we're learning is that more and more of the PFAS coming into our plants as we try to identify high-level industrial sources, we're now left with a lot of domestic loads that can only be controlled at the front end. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. And so obviously, this is our challenge, is that all of our waste come into the plants, and PFAS, as you've already heard, they don't really break down except to other PFAS. So they're either going to be in the wastewater or they're going to be sorbed to the sludge that we like to optimize use in a circular economy and convert to biosolids that can be land applied as a very carbon rich, nutrient rich, slow release fertilizer. And I think the slow release is important to realize too, because when we apply synthetic fertilizer, that's how we end up with nitrate problems in our groundwater and our surface water, where biosolids release nutrients slow, such that the plants can use them slowly. So we have to deal with them at the water resource recovery end right now. And so over half of our biosolids right now are land applied. And as you've heard, there are, you know, talks of banning land application of biosolids, which will have a lot of adverse effects. You'll hear, again, I'll say a little bit of that at the end, and then I'm sure Chris Piot will highlight more of that. So people always ask, what's in the biosolids? This is the only chemistry slide you're going to suffer with me. There are a lot of PFAS in biosolids because we use a lot of PFAS in everyday things. And I can't express that enough. We are trying to solve a problem at the back end when it needs to be solved at the front end. So these are just a host of the PFAS that was already mentioned. And some of the most common ones we find are these more complex ones that then transform into the ones that we tend to quantify. So this is just trying to show you that not all biosolids are equal. This represents biosolids that we collected for a few years from East to West Coast. And they all have their kind of their own signatures depending on what's coming in with, like I said, this one here at the bottom is a really good example of what is in fast food packaging. And so when we talk about biosolids being land applied, our biggest concern is, okay, is the PFAS going to get to groundwater or the PFAS going to get into plants? And so I'm just going to make a few comments on those to let you know where we are and what we know. But I will tell you that there's still a lot of science to be done. And that's really important to realize that we don't make too many regulations that are over conservative before we actually have the science foundation for it. So I'm just showing you here land application of biosolids. Whatever's in the biosolids could be run off into surface water, affecting aquatics, could be leached into groundwater, affecting a water resource for drinking water. Surface water sometimes is also a source of drinking water. So that's important. And then in a lot of states, we have tile drainage. And you do have it even in some of the states up in the Northeast. We have a lot in the Midwest. And tile drainage just captures the water, leaving the biosolids and kind of bypasses it going to groundwater, and it goes directly to surface water. And in some ways, this actually is a benefit in terms of any kind of contaminant, whether it's hormones and antibiotics and manure, or if it's PFAS and biosolids. Okay, so where are we in regards to PFAS and land application of biosolids? So we know PFAS release from land application of biosolids occurs. However, right now what we see is the general recycling of biosolids to soil. It hasn't been shown to be a significant contributor above the ubiquitous exposure of PFAS. As already mentioned, it is in our rainwater now. Anywhere, you can just capture about any rainwater and find it there. So it is landing on our soils consistently from lots of atmospheric deposition and rainwater. And studies have shown so far that when we have significant impacts, they're typically from military sites where these very valuable AFFFs, these aqueous film forming foams, were used, particularly when they were used for training. That's when we put so much into the environment, is just repeated use. And the better the firefighters were at putting out fires, the more AFFF they got to use, because they had to burn whatever was put on fire, because usually they used other waste to create the fire. And then airports, they have to use the aqueous film forming foams. They're very specific to hydrocarbon fires, and they also would train. And I've been to one of these trainings, and this is one way, not just airports, all the training, when they're spraying it in the air, unless you have a completely windless day, which never occurs, these things are just flying everywhere in the air, and they're being transported everywhere, and they can transport in the atmosphere for 7 months. And then we have a lot of industrial direct discharges that were occurring, and we still do with some of the PFAS replacements that are still PFAS. Then you might have some land disposal scenarios. And then you have the biosolid impacted scenarios. And these were typically biosolids that were very heavily impacted from industrial discharges into the wastewater resource recovery facilities. So it's really important that there's multiple ways that these emissions can get into soil, not just biosolids. And where we've really seen a problem so far is biosolids that were heavily impacted by, PFAS contaminated industrial discharge, including like paper mill sludge. So I think that's an important context to remember. And except for these really rare worst case scenarios, we really have not seen significant impacts of general practices of land application of biosolids, and human exposure pathways have been shown so far to be minimal. So I wanted to show you two pieces of data that's not in the literature yet, that is from a project that I'm working on. I have several EPA funded and CERTA funded PFAS projects. This one, we are looking at water in Indiana, rural water supplies in Indiana, because there was a concern, well, what's actually happening in all the agricultural operations where biosolids are used? And what you'll see here from the data we've collected so far, just about 100 samples and still collecting more, you'll see in this map, all the green area is where we land apply biosolids. So there's a lot of land application that happens in our county here where Purdue is. And then you'll see the little dots represent where we've measured and what the total PFAS, and as was mentioned, PFAS is all the suite of PFAS that can be measured. And we measure close to 60 now. But typically what you'll see in water is less than about a dozen. And you can see that most of the time we have even just total PFAS is less than 5 parts per trillion. And as was noted, 1 part per trillion is just like 1 second in 32,000 years. So it's really important to realize how small that amount is. And then there was really, and PFOA and PFAS are two infamous PFAS, the ones we put attention on the most in early years. We're below the 1 nanogram per liter measure, which is now below the new EPA proposed regulatory, enforceable regulatory guidelines. And we only had one case where we had higher than 10 parts per trillion. And that was really, well, I guess we had about 4% that were above 20, but the highest we saw was 35 parts per trillion. And that was not PFAS or PFOA, it was some of the shorter chain. And you'll hear more about regulatory things in a little bit. Here's the results from the Pennsylvania rural water study, and that's still ongoing. Both of us are still collecting samples. So this was data from 68 samples, and all the gray spaces are where land application is known to occur in Pennsylvania. And then you'll see the colored bubbles are reflecting PFAS concentrations. And yes, there was 1 or more PFAS, typically the short chain, that was seen in about 3/4 of the samples. The maximum total PFAS, so sum of all the PFAS found, was only at 80 parts per trillion. And again, close to 3/4 had PFAS or PFOA, but really only one exceeded Pennsylvania guidelines of 14 parts per trillion. That's their current guidelines and that was for PFOA. None of them exceeded it for their PFAS guidelines. And as you'll hear even more about, there's, guidelines are different in every single state. So in terms of PFAS uptake, and it's usually a certain suite of PFASs that get taken up, that can be taken up by plants. We call those the perfluoroalkyl acids. For the most part, first of all, people always say, well, what are these PFAS doing to plants? Well, nothing. The PFAS don't even see the plants. They love biosolids. You can show 2 field plots where biosolids are used and where they're not. And plants are so happy on the biosolids plant side. In fact, we have an agricultural site at Purdue where they applied really high rates of biosolids for a research study in the days when we were caring about metal concerns in biosolids, which is not a concern now. And even that the sites, you can still tell where the biosolids were applied. Let's see, 10, 20, 30, 5 years later, because the soils are rich and dark, the plants actually come up faster in those soils. They start to, and they're taller in those soils. So talking about corn that I can see from a plane. And so plants are happy, but PFAS can get taken up in plants, and it's mostly the short chains that have where regulatory guidelines are either non-existent or are very high levels relative to the 4 parts per trillion for PFAS and PFOA. And they can only be taken up by the plant for as long as the plant is in the media, which is really, not a long time. And so if you apply higher biosolids, like in cases where we might want to look at what happens when we're trying to reclaim brownfields, and we might under those guidelines, you can apply a lot, 5 times higher biosolids. Yes, you might see a little more taken up by the plant, but again, it's mostly the short chain. For the longer chains that are more strict in terms of regulatory and health concerns, they're going to tend to be on the outside of they're going to be on the roots or the outside of our root vegetables. Some can transport into the vegetable, but very little. And again, those tend to be, again, short chain. And most of the available data that we're judging all this PFAS uptake by plants are in pot studies where they only water enough to keep everything in the soil profile, but they don't want water draining out, or hydroponic studies. So in both these cases, uptake is going to be maximized, and very few studies are field studies with land application of biosolids. So there are currently several funded EPA projects and a few other projects that are looking to better understand this. So what's our PFAS? I just really want to end with a path forward for PFAS. So you've heard this several times, the use. So in order to really control the problem and minimize expenses at the back end, we need to control the sources. The truth is, military knew they had PFAS in their groundwater 4 decades ago, but nobody wanted to step forward in case this was a concern. So for 4 decades, we could have stopped training with AFFFs. So same thing here. We can stop PFAS at the front end. So pre-treatment of high PFAS containing influent, but also regulating non-essential uses. There are a lot of non-essential uses, and I know there are some scientists that want to see complete bans of all use because of concerns of what will get discharged at the manufacturing end. But really, rather than argue at this, let's get rid of the non-essential uses right away. Food packaging, cosmetics, carpets, textiles. I mean, the list is so long where we already know we have alternatives. Let's continue to support growing the science, funding, making funding available to look at fate, treatment, toxicity, and alternatives. Let's fund people. Let's give incentives for people to be innovative. We are the United States of America. We are innovative. When we're faced with a challenge, we get innovative. Let's have adaptable plans for biosolids application. Banning is not an adaptable or sustainable plan. There's a lot of places, depending on geography, soil type, climate, depth to groundwater, where, biosolids have such an insignificant chance of affecting human exposure. So let's think about that. We can also manage risk by just blending biosolids with other local wastes that are PFAS negligible. And so I think you're going to hear more about the impacts of making a choice to completely ban biosolids. So I won't mention them now, but they really do cause over conservative regulations, and banning biosolids really will cause a lot of unintended and unnecessary consequences. So that's just, that's what today's good, because we're bringing a lot of people to the table so that we can, really talk about this with the science that we know and the challenge that we have, which just really includes everybody. So I say, let's be fast to regulate non-essential uses, slow to make, bans on land application of biosolids, and anything that's really too conservative right now. And I think in the end, we can all be winners, because as we get rid of the sources, this problem that we're dealing with at the back end, it's going to go away. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Lee. We appreciate it. Next up, we have the Wunderkind of Regional Biosolids and PFAS Management, Chris Piat from DC Water. Oh, you bet
Yeah, I think I'm going to use this one. There were some problems with it earlier. I like Wunderkind. That's good, though. Thanks. I'll take that title. So, hi. Yeah, I wanted to talk about risk and some of the economics behind remediating the, I'm going to use air quotes, problem of PFAS and biosolids. EPA has a risk assessment that is underway right now. I'm not going to talk in great detail about that. Just suffice it to say that they're doing this. They've got all kinds of different exposure routes. They're doing a lot of science, trying to fill the gaps in the science. And we're very supportive of that, not just in theory, but we're involved directly involved in 2 of the EPA studies. We're also involved in some studies outside of EPA, one with the local chapter of the Sierra Club, one with the University of Arizona. And in fact, next week we are delivering, I think I am delivering some biosolids to a Johns Hopkins research plot for one of the EPA studies. They're looking at fate and transport of biosolids, PFAS contaminants. And we're very supportive of the science because we strongly believe that it will support our contention that the risks of land application are very low. But if not, we also want to know that if we find something in all of these studies that indicates that it is a high risk, then we want to know that too. Then we'll do something else with the biosolids. So there is nothing bad that can come from this science, and we're extremely supportive of it, and we're happy that EPA is conducting some of it. So I want to talk about sort of the risk relative to other exposures and the costs associated with remediation or alternatives to land application, because they're extremely high. And we need to really determine, both Rosa and Joe talked about the fact that PFAS is in all of our blood, it's in our blood serum, and we need to figure out whether or not these efforts to remediate in biosolids would even move the needle. I suspect that if we took all the biosolids produced in the US and shot them into space, it would have no effect on the blood serum in the US population. My contention, I haven't done the math yet, but you know what? I'm also happy that EPA is focusing on source control, because that's really where we can make a difference. Getting these products off of our shelves that come into our homes, that end up in the wastewater treatment plant, and then end up in our beautiful biosolids. I'm going to pass this around. I don't want to get too far along before I do this. This is some of our beautiful Bloom blend. It's one of our blends. And full disclosure, this has 1/3 of this is Bloom biosolids, and it has some PFAS in it, very low levels, about 15 parts per billion of PFAS and about 3 parts per billion of PFOA. And as you will see from my slides, that is not a high level, but I just want to pass this around. I wouldn't eat it because it tastes like dirt, but it's beautiful. I'm so proud of what we do here. So, we need to see whether or not that we're even going to move the needle, because we are an easy target in areas where they found wells contaminated with biosolids. Everybody immediately points the finger towards, wells contaminated with PFAS, they immediately point the finger at biosolids because we are an easy target. Nobody wants to think about their poop. That's why we're here. And it's an easy target. Maine banned biosolids. They didn't really ban it, but they set levels that they knew nobody could meet. So it's a de facto ban. Because there were 3 farms, I'm oversimplifying it, but there were 3 farms that were land applied in the 80s with paper mill sludge that had extremely high levels of PFAS in them. And then they painted all biosolids with the same brush, and they banned biosolids. Tucson, Arizona found some wells that had PFAS in them. They saw biosolids land application in the county. They said, oh, it must be that. They have to appear to be doing something, so they banned biosolids. And the utility, I'm going to talk about this research a little bit, but the utility said, well, that's supremely unscientific. So they did some science and ultimately lifted the moratorium because science prevailed. We really need to complete the nutrient and carbon cycles. It's the way that the earth is supposed to work, right? We are living creatures. We're part of the ecosystem, and we're all other creatures contribute their feces to the earth to make more soil and to feed the soil microbes. And for us to lock it away somewhere because there is some small risk associated with PFAS or other things, I think it's just not sustainable. I get it for something like nuclear waste, right? Nuclear waste makes this radioactive concentrated waste. It's not supposed to be here. So we drill a hole in some mountain in some western state and we lock it in there. We want clean energy, but we can't do that with biosolids. We really have to do the science and let the science prevail. So what was the last slide? Sorry. So it enters, this is an oversimplification, but of course it enters the wastewater treatment plant because society uses these PFAS-laden products. And paper and plastic waste go to landfills or incinerators. Landfills then send their leachates to wastewater treatment plants for treatment where it gets concentrated. And incinerators send PFAS out of their exhaust, which is probably why we have contamination in virgin lands that have never received biosolids. Products and food waste enter the sewers through sinks, laundry, and industry. And I attended 2 papers at WEFTEC this year that looked at sewer sheds, and they were examining where PFAS came from coming into the treatment plants. And of course, industrial areas had higher concentrations. But if you did the mass balance, 80% of the mass was coming from residential areas, much lower concentrations, but higher flow. So that was really interesting. It's because we use these products and we're creatures of convenience. You know, we want to make sure that when I inevitably spill my coffee onto this carpet later today, that it will be easy to clean up. And that's because it's got PFAS in it. It's stain resistant. Next slide, please, Scott. So this is our beautiful biosolids product. We're very proud of this. Please check out our website, bloomsoil.com. It is a Class A exceptional quality biosolids. It is low odor. It's beautiful. We sell a lot of it. We sold 58,000 tons or 55,000 tons of it last year. Next slide, please. One more propaganda slide here. The benefits of Bloom are that it's a great value to the farmers for soil health. It reduces their costs, helps preserve agriculture because agriculture and farming is very expensive, completes that nutrient and carbon cycle, reduces our carbon footprint, protects the Chesapeake Bay, and then ultimately reduces the cost for our ratepayers. Next slide, please. So I don't expect you to see all these numbers on here, but a few years ago, I guess it was about 18 months ago, the Sierra Club came out with a report that showed that products containing biosolids had, in their mind, extremely high levels of PFAS in them. I'll show you very soon that it's not extremely high levels. They tested, we would have gladly cooperated with them on this research, but they went to a hardware store and they bought a bag of our cured Bloom and tested it. And it was higher than what we get when we test our biosolids. Our fresh biosolids is much lower. There's a couple reasons that might be true. It could have something to do with our process. It could be the fact that it was stored in a plastic bag for 18 months. We don't really know. But when we test our biosolids, and we've done it several times, it's always in this range. It's considerably lower than they got for our cured product. We also are testing through Linda Lee at Purdue, our cured product, and we're going to have those products soon. But even if at our lower limits for our fresh Bloom, we didn't meet the main limits that were set that really acted as a de facto ban on any producers in Maine to land apply in the state. But I'm going to talk about this later. Michigan took a different approach and they segregated between industrial biosolids and industrial sludges and municipal biosolids, which really have sort of societal background levels of PFAS in them, similar to what we find in our homes. And we easily meet those limits. I'll go into that a little bit later. Scott? So what is the relative risk? You know, this is a study that was done in Sweden on household dust across several different countries. It did not include the US. I've got another data point for the US. But they found that the mean across all of these samples was about 550 parts per billion for the suite of compounds that they tested for. They tested for less than fewer compounds than we test for. Ours, when you add up all of the compounds in the PFAS family, came out to about 42 parts per billion. So that, you know, household dust is 10 times higher concentration than we have in our biosolids. Next slide, please. And this is a slide that Brian showed earlier, but I just want to go into it a little bit more in depth because, you know, there's the number for US blood serum. It's about 7 parts per billion. We all have that on average. Our Bloom is about 42 parts per billion. School uniforms tested out at 117. Daycare dust, that's a different study than the one that was done across Europe and other countries, was about, I can't read, over 500. So it was in that same range, 550 for the other study, 523 for this. Well, here's where it gets interesting. You know, cosmetics that everybody uses, not everybody, but a lot of people use cosmetics have PFAS in them because they're water resistant. And we don't want, you know, when we're accepting our Oscar and we're doing our acceptance speech and we're crying, we don't want our mascara to run, right? So again, it's a convenience thing. You know, we want it to stay on our face. When we sweat or when we're out in the rain, we don't want it to run off. This next one, organic pasta sauce. This also came from a study done by the Sierra Club. And I have a love-hate relationship with this data point because I hate the fact that it's in food, but I love the fact that it's organic pasta sauce, which means definitively that there was no biosolids put on this, because USDA does not allow biosolids to be on organic food. And ketchup, and then it gets up to food packaging limit. The average number for the national average for food packaging is over 875,000 parts per billion. California was recently lauded for putting a limit on PFAS in food packaging at 100 parts per million, but that's 100,000 parts per billion. So if in the future biosolids is banned, a California farmer could still take his kids through the drive-through at McDonald's, get French fries, and have up to 100,000 parts per billion touching his fries that they go into their mouth. So it's really, we need to understand where the exposure risks are and how we sort of shake out in that exposure window. And I don't know who mentioned, I think it was you, Joe, or somebody mentioned that it's also in precipitation. This is from a study that looked at samples in 2019, and all the samples contained PFAS. And up until a couple of weeks ago, we didn't have the draft drinking water limits, but we had the EPA health advisory levels, which, you know, all it means is that there are above those levels, it warrants further studies. So they were originally those health advisory levels were 0.004 parts per trillion and 0.02 parts per trillion. None of these precipitation numbers would meet those. They all exceed that limit. And some of these probably exceed the draft drinking water limits. So it's everywhere. Where does this come from? It's probably from, again, I'm not sure, but it's probably from atmospheric deposition from plastics and papers that are treated with PFAS, you know, going up a stack and then ending up on farm fields and in precipitation. Next one, please. So the tale of two bands, I mentioned this earlier. Maine banned biosolids because they found 3 farms that had high concentrations of PFAS in the soil, and they got hits of PFAS in the wells below those farm fields. And those were extremely high concentrations of paper mill sludge on those farms, and then all the biosolids got painted with the same sludge. And this was in the face of extreme public outcry, and they needed to do something, and we were an easy target. In Arizona, same thing happened. They got some hits in some wells in Tucson, and they placed a moratorium on biosolids land application in the county. The utilities said, well, that was supremely unscientific. Let's do some studies. So they worked with Dr. Ian Pepper from the University of Arizona, and they studied it and ultimately overturned the moratorium. I'm going to show you some of that data in a second. Next slide, please. So this is intentionally, it's sort of intentionally to show that the 3 data points on the left are extremely low, and those were all from the Arizona study. So those were studies of farms that had received in Pima County 5 to 10 years of land application at agronomic rates, 15 to 20 years of land application at agronomic rates, and then the third one from the left is farms that never received biosolids. And these numbers are all statistically identical. There is no difference in the PFAS level statistically between farms that receive 15 to 20 years of land applied biosolids that had, you know, municipal background levels of PFAS and those that had received none. The one on the right is Songbird Farm in Maine. That was one of the farms that had received the paper mill sludge. And that was 475 parts per billion. And if you do the math on that, back calculate the levels that would have had to have been in the paper mill sludge, it would have been roughly 100,000 parts per billion. So we need to separate between industrial sludges and municipal biosolids. Next one, please. And then this is the second half of Ian's study in Arizona, is he did a study looking at the attenuation of PFAS compounds as you go deeper into the soil. And he found that over 90% of the compounds are attenuated, fully attenuated, I'm sorry, the compounds are 90% attenuated at a depth of 6 feet. And now I understand Arizona soils aren't the same as mid-Atlantic soils or Florida soils, and the water depth is deeper. But when they presented this data to the county commissioners, and they saw that it wasn't reaching the groundwater, and that the farms that had no biosolids land application had the same amounts of PFAS as those that received it, they lifted the moratorium. So science prevailed. Ian is duplicating this study across the nation. There are 2 sites that we are using in hopefully 1 for sure, maybe 2, in this region, so that we can show it in these soils. And he's got 12 other sites across the country. So again, trying to fill some of those science gaps. So this is Michigan. Michigan took a different approach. They tried to separate between industrially impacted sludges and those that had municipal background levels. And they surveyed, they took samples from every major wastewater treatment plant in the state. And the ones, this is a logarithmic graph scale on the left. So the purple ones on the right, the highest ones are above 1,000. The highest ones on the right are above 2,000 parts per billion. And the red ones are all below 100 parts per billion. So they set limits to eliminate land application of industrially impacted biosolids. Those that are above 130 parts per billion cannot be land applied at all. If it's between 50 and 130, you can do limited land application, and below 50, you can do unlimited land application of biosolids. So we would easily meet that with our fresh biosolids and with our cured biosolids, because they made this distinction and there was some science involved. Next one, Scott. So what does this do to the costs? We have some very real examples to what happened in the Northeast and in Pima County, Arizona, when moratoriums were imposed. And there were some extreme cases where the costs were 0 because they were land applying biosolids on their own land, and they went up to $100 a ton. But on average, it quadrupled the cost, tripled or quadrupled the cost to take it elsewhere, land apply it elsewhere, go to landfills. The average increase was about $80 a ton. And if you do the math for us, our current $4.5 million per year budget for land application would balloon up to $20 million a year. And I'm fine if this is really truly solving an environmental and a health problem, but I'm not fine with it if it's not going to move the needle and if the risks are low. So we're hoping that we will fill some of those gaps with the science. Next one. So our position is that we really look forward to the results of the risk assessment, and we really think that it's going to support the work of Ian Pepper and other people that say that the science supports that the risk is low. But as I said earlier, if it says something different, we want to know that too. So ultimately, we would like to continue land applying our biosolids because it serves as a resource for farmers to reduce dependency on chemical fertilizers, which of course are made from natural gas, which adds to the carbon footprint. But it also sequesters carbon, lowers our carbon footprint, and saves valuable ratepayer funds. That's all I have. Thanks.
Now that you've been bombarded with chemistry and a new vocabulary and all sorts of other things, we want to open it up for questions. So if you can raise your hand and ask your questions in the with the microphone, that'd be great. Oh, actually, we'll start with somebody who does not a regular.
Okay, so I'm not a regular. So you had mentioned about the Class A biosolids. So what exactly is a Class A biosolid, and does it apply to farmers, to land applications? I think I kind of got the answer later on, but is that correct?
Yeah, it's an EPA designation, and there are 3 different classes of solids that come out of a treatment plant. There's raw solids that are untreated. Those we don't even call biosolids. Those are just sludge. Horrible name. Can't really do much with that. There's class B biosolids, which receives some pathogen reduction treatment, and that can go to farms because exposure to the elements reduces the pathogens by 99%, potential pathogens, just through exposure to the elements. But class A means that all the pathogens have been completely destroyed. We do it through heat, high heat and pressure here. Brian's system is going to be the same as ours. And that can also go to farms, but it can also be sold to the public. And we can't sell class B material directly to the public because we haven't completely eliminated all the pathogens.
And then if I understood correctly, that also reduces the need for treatment for invasives like herbicides on the land eventually, or no? Was I reading too much into that?
I think you were reading too much into it, but it promotes soil health. There were some studies that were done in Arizona, not from Ian Pepper, but other people, that showed that if you use biosolids, which have beneficial microbes in them, it makes the soils much healthier, and then the soils can then fight off soil diseases like nematodes, and then you don't need as many herbicides and fungicides and things like that. So
Okay.
it's
So it's
indirectly
positive.
true.
Yeah. So it's not as big as a positive I thought, but it's a positive.
Yes.
All right. Next. Hi, so I'm going to take off my DC Water hat and put on my Prince George's hat, because it sounds like from your presentation that I am operating industrial facilities that may be contributing to this. So I operate the landfill and the OCF in Prince George's County. And I know we're working with DC Water on testing some of our leachate from the wastewater treatment plant. And now we're going to be doing some research to look both at our solid application, which is Leaf Grow Gold made from food scraps, as well as our leachated OCF. But I guess I'm wondering, when I see this and you're telling me that a lot of this concentration comes from this type of site, what else should I be doing to look for ways to contribute to this science as we're trying to figure out what the inputs into both WSSC and DC Water would be from these types of facilities?
Well, beyond what you're already doing, I'm not sure. I appreciate the willingness to submit samples for testing, because that's the only way that we're going to do a mass balance on these things. And then, we got to look at the state of the science, and if we find that, say, leachate has high levels, then we have to implement something probably at the source to treat it before it enters the sewers or before it gets trucked to us, because it's much more efficient to do it that way than to treat the higher flow. So I guess just the willingness to cooperate and the willingness to submit samples for testing. It's scary to do sampling because we don't always like what we find. So I really appreciate your willingness.
I might also comment that one of the things to do is do that mass balance and know what your concentration is, know what your flow is, and then calculate out what would be the concentration due to leachate for the overall bulk wastewater flow. And we have found in some Midwest plants that the volumes or the flows are so small that compared to the other inputs, it wasn't now I'm not saying that's the case here, and I'm not saying that if they're very, very high, there shouldn't be some kind of treatment that should occur. But I'm just saying that's another way to help evaluate the overall big picture.
Yeah, and if you're talking about Brown Station landfill in Prince George's County, that flow goes to our Western Branch facility, as you already know, and we do influent testing. One of my slides, which I'm sure you couldn't read because the font was so small, but we test the influent at Western Branch for the PFAS. So, and I'm sure there'll be some more technologies that come up, but yeah, right now I think open lines of communication and sharing data is the best thing.
Linda, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is back to particularly what you're doing, but I know I've heard, we've seen, data for landfill leachate, the flow volume is low. So even if the PFAS concentrations might be at the higher end for some leachate, then the total PFAS load coming into the plant, it might not contribute as much to the total PFAS load as one might think, because the concentrations are high, but the volume coming in is low. And then this is why more and more we realize how much of the PFAS load, although coming in is very dilute, is actually coming from domestic sources. And so it's, so it's all a balance of volume and concentration.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one thing I should have asked at the very beginning, which is when you start asking your question, to say your name and what agency or entity you're representing. So, Jeff, you can be the first one to show us the example.
Oh, boy. I'm Jeff Steers with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. I guess one of the things, kind of from a big picture, I'm curious if you all have dealt with taking the science behind this and how risk communication can work with utilities, because I mean, in Virginia, we're trying to work between us and the health department. We're trying to come up with a risk communication and strategy around emerging contaminants. And so, it's you can represent some of this about what a part per trillion means, but have you had any experience, any of you, in trying to communicate this in a way that's easily understandable with the public, especially as regulations start to evolve and people get confused? What does this mean to my drinking water, for example?
So before we start to answer, I'm going to put in a plug. At the Council of Governments, we have weekly PFAS calls with all of the communicators. And we've worked on our talking points and really worked on some strategies that we are happy to talk about and share. But we have, the communications folks have different communication experiences than these folks. So go ahead and answer.
I'll start. And just first of all, Jeff, I would love to come and present whenever and wherever you want to whoever you want, because I think it's extremely important to get this information into the brains of the public. That relative risk slide that I have is really effective, just to show people that the products that they use every day have way more PFAS than the biosolids that might be on a farm that's 5 miles away from them. That's really effective. But I've adopted this sort of mantra that we need to disseminate this information to people who don't know about it. I was on a call yesterday with a bunch of people, and one of my coworkers said, I use this stuff on the lawn and the kids use it, and my wife read an article and now she's all freaked out. And I said, I get it. I totally get it. If something similar happened to me, the analogy I used yesterday was, if a spaceship landed in my backyard and dropped off a pile of green goo and I didn't know anything about it, I would want it out of there. I wouldn't want anything to do with it. And that's sort of the same with biosolids. If they don't have the information, they're going to take a conservative approach. So we need to disseminate this. And like I said, I'll come down anytime. I'd love to do it.
Yeah, I share the same sentiments. As you can imagine, over 28 years in the industry, I've done a lot of public speaking and going to different communities. Most recently, because of our new bioenergy facility, we went out to the community. It was the Greater Accokeek Community Association, Piscataway. And we discussed PFAS a little bit. Dr. Jen was there from WSSC. And one of their major concerns was truck traffic. They weren't concerned about PFAS as much as how many extra vehicles are going to be on the road and how is this going to affect my commute. So sometimes you have a very interested community, and sometimes you have people that have things that that are more pressing. But yeah, I agree. I think it's our jobs as professionals to do things like this and to go to speak out more.
I guess I would just say I practice or would advocate practicing the 3 C's, which are communicate, and when you're done communicating, communicate some more. The second thing is I would keep the messages simple that you want to make. We as practitioners, as well as scientists, love to slip into molecular mechanism talk and all that kind of stuff, but keep them simple. And then 3, keep them few. Don't come out with a whole bunch of different messages, especially messages that tend to vary from talk to talk to talk to talk. And lastly, I would just on AWWA website, if you're there, they have a lot of information that you can access on communicating, and specifically for PFAS.
Linda, I'm going to give you the last word because we need to roll up and have our next speaker.
Yeah, I'll just say that I tell people, listen, you just, calm down, be even keeled. You've been living with these compounds in your home and your office environment for decades. And now that we realize they don't break down, even if we don't understand all their potential effects, we just need to minimize their use. And so I just encourage them to do their part and know what's in their products. And so I try to, give them some control. That's something they can control. And then they asked me, would you use biosolids? Do you use biosolids on your gardens? And I was like, I do. So that hopefully helps a little bit to minimize their concern.
Thanks, Linda. We're going to have a slight change in the agenda. Carolyn was detained for a little bit, so Chris Pomeroy from Aqualaw has graciously agreed to give his presentation next. And I think we asked for this presentation specifically because I think like Andrea was saying, the implications for if you have solid waste are pretty significant. And also if your drinking water utility is part of your jurisdiction. Microphone?
Yeah, I might just use this. That's good. Oh, thank you, sir.
So Chris is the president of Aqualaw, which is a law firm in Richmond that specializes in water law, water legislation, and water regulation. Is that fair to say, Chris?
That is fair to say.
And let's see. So Chris is the president of Aqualaw, a boutique law firm representing local government clients across the U.S. and many individual governments, authorities, and commissions. He's advised the Virginia Maryland Association of Municipal Wastewater Agencies, the Virginia Maryland Stormwater Associations, and the Virginia Municipal Drinking Water Association. Chris co-founded Aqualaw in 2002. Take it away.
All righty. Well, thank you, Lisa, and good morning to everybody. It's good to be with you today. So I've got the task, and you have the chore, I guess, of suffering through the legal aspects of this. We'll try to have a kind of a wide-ranging touch on different components of this, and I'm going to try to pull together some of the things that I heard and new things I was learning this morning about some of the detailed aspects here. I guess legal implications, what am I referring to when we use that term in the title? I was told that I'm speaking about legal implications. I was not told how I have to define that. So I'm going to take a fairly broad definition to include some legislative policy-making aspects, some regulatory policy-making aspects, some cooperative undertakings by agreement or less formal mechanisms. And I will touch on judicial or litigation aspects from both a plaintiff and a defense standpoint. And we'll do all that in about 15 minutes, I guess. But, and then what we're going to do is we're going to have a deck that consists of one slide only, which is here. And this is going to let me jump around a little bit and fairly selectively touch on some of the things that I guess I would like to say, or I was prompted to say, listening to the excellent program thus far this morning. And before I go any further, let me just say it is really a privilege to be back with all of you at a COG meeting again. This is the first time I've had the privilege of doing that with you on the subject of PFAS. We've done that many times over the years together on different water topics. It was a pleasure to see Supervisor Gross here this morning. Chesapeake Bay nutrients have been one of those topics through the COG Water Quality Committee over the years. But today on PFAS, it bears emphasis, I think, as we get into legal aspects. What I know we've heard in one way or another throughout the morning, but there is a lot of uncertainty in what we are dealing with here. And as in many other aspects we've discussed, it's true also in legal that things are evolving, that there are uncertainties, but also that the activity is increasing and it's moving in a direction of really tackling the challenge that lies in front of us. So with the one slide here, I guess maybe just to get oriented, and then once we get oriented, I am going to use it to jump around a little. In the middle column under the green box, I refer to these items as types of impacts on utilities. I kind of think of this as the what column, what's going on, what might be going on. And in the right-hand column, I've labeled this different types of actions involving utilities. And we might think about this from, this is the who column. We'll talk a bit about different actors and different roles in this. I guess the first thing that, first comment I want to make falls in the overall box of monitoring. I remember it was probably, I can't quite place some of these meetings relative to when we were going to meetings and when we weren't, but it was one of those NACWA utility management meetings somewhere around the country, and we were told you're breaking out into breakout groups. And we sat at round tables scattered across the hotel ballroom, and the discussion of the day was to monitor or not to monitor. That was the question, to monitor or not to monitor. And it's a serious question. It's a difficult question in a world where you're operating with few or no defined thresholds. For years, I've been involved in conversations that say, as many of you have, I'm sure, oh, we're going to monitor. What are we looking for? And once we get this data, what exactly are we going to do with it? Are we just going to have a bunch of data sitting here on the table? We very much still have that challenge here. But when I had to answer that question going around the table at the NACWA meeting that year, I took a different view on PFAS than I had taken on this issue in terms of my own personal perspective on it for many years running. And that year I said, you know, I'm going to fall in the monitoring camp even though I don't know what to do with it after I spend all that money on it. And one of the main reasons I thought that was, if I were the utilities director, general manager, when I get the phone call that says, hey, have you ever heard of PFAS? And of course my answer is yes. I would like to be able to answer the next question that you know is coming. Well, do we have it in our system? And even though I don't know what to do with the data once I have it, and although that situation's, I'll say, improving a little bit in the MCL world, for better or for worse, I think a worse answer, I was coming around to the view that a worse answer is to say, well, do we have it? Well, not only do I not know, I haven't looked. And all of this has since accelerated in that time. So monitoring, we're very much moving into a monitoring space that has challenges with it. Is monitoring voluntary or is it commanded through our permits? The practical aspects, turnaround times right now are terrible. How many people can get a sample back in a month if you wanted it on PFAS? I think nobody. I know Chemours can get sample turnaround on 2 days from Eurofins, but I think everyone else is probably waiting 2 or 3 months. So just the practicalities of that are very difficult. But where we're heading is what? In Maryland, MDE, they have a list of they have a kind of a top 15. Some WSSC plants are on that list. There are others on that list. The top 15. Top 15 are getting monitoring provisions in their NPDES permits for their wastewater plants. Virginia DEQ, Mr. Steers, Jeff, thanks for being here today. DEQ is also thinking about, how to best move into this arena for some of those same practical considerations. We all want data that's useful in the work we're doing together. It does beg the question, what do we do with it once we get it? But there's a general kind of growing sense that I feel across the industry that we're going to need the data as we work to kind of figure this out. And it's going to screen some of our facilities into an extended discussion, and it's going to screen others out due to a sense that numbers are lower there. So more monitoring. And that's across all three of the horizontal rows here at our water plants, in our wastewater influent and effluent, and of course in biosolids. Building on the monitoring piece, or maybe doing more monitoring, if you look at some of the other emerging contaminant programs, I think of PCBs most notably in the DC region. Well, where did that go? That tends to go in, okay, now I've got it, I'm going to stick with the wastewater plant for a moment, but there's a source water plant version of this too. Now that I have it in the wastewater plant, okay, it's in my effluent, or there's a little bit of my biosolids, there's maybe a bit more in my effluent. I'm looking at influent. I'm seeing if that's changing or increasing off the plant, but now I have it, I know it's coming in the front door at the plant. So now I'm moving out. And I expect that in the future, we will be looking upstream with various types of track down programs like have been used for PCBs, mercury, and things like that in other Clean Water Act contexts. And eventually that's going to lead us to the doorstep. I'll stick with the collection system side of this, of some industrial users of our sewer system. And we're going to need their help. And we're going to hope that we get it voluntarily. And if we don't, and the numbers are too high such that they are jeopardizing the levels we are discharging or the quality of our biosolids product to maintain the nice low numbers like Chris Piot was showing a moment ago, we're going to have to insist. And it's going to be a challenge for us to insist, but we're going to have to do it. Why is it going to be a challenge? Well, what regulatory thresholds exactly are there that we can pluck from the regulations and use for this purpose? It may turn out to be the case that we might start rewriting our sewer use ordinances to impose some level of control on discharges to our sanitary sewer systems. We tend to think about the more prominent regulations are the ones that flow directly from, say, the Clean Water Act and NPDES, or the Safe Drinking Water Act and the primary drinking water regulations. But if you go and look at local authority on use of the sewer collection system, we have significant local authorities that do not depend upon specific federal numbers. Maybe we need to exercise some of that authority to protect our infrastructure and our operations downstream in various components, including what we're discharging back to the streams. Most discharges are someone else's raw water supply, and protecting our biosolids to make sure those numbers can stay nice and low. So I think we're going to see a lot more track down and some challenging, difficult, but necessary conversations with industrial users that have discharges of their own into our systems that are higher than seem reasonable under the totality of these circumstances. The regulatory agencies with direct industrial dischargers, Jeff, your agency DEQ, if your counterpart Lee Curry were here from MDE, same type of thing. They're going to have to do this directly with individual dischargers that have surface water discharges. I'm going to jump back into some of the policy making piece, but now I'm going to kind of jump back up to the legislative level. This is a place where we're going to have to be very prepared and very active across all the COG member communities, particularly in the two general assemblies. I could say I had a fun time just reminiscing briefly with Chris Piot, our prior speaker, on what I'll loosely call the sludge wars that had to do a lot with kind of NIMBY reaction, particularly with the level of land usage for the region across rural parts of Virginia, going back in the aftermath of a Virginia Supreme Court decision about 20 years ago now that said it's not for every locality to make up different sets of land application restrictions or bans. That's preempted by state policy. So it's the state permitting program that controls. And what happened in the aftermath was, and some of you lived through this, I'm looking at some of the faces around the room, years and years of years and years of General Assembly sessions with bills suggesting new restrictions on biosolids land application, storage restrictions, application rate restrictions, time and place restrictions, all sorts of restrictions, returning authority to localities to ban at will, all sorts of restrictions. That could very well be coming here again. We went through a round of that when flame retardants were all the thing on biosolids. That kind of spurred that whole ban interest again. How can this PFAS discussion, now that it's a front page issue in all the newspapers here and there and everywhere, how can that ban conversation not come up here, there, and everywhere? We just all need to be prepared to show that we're doing the good type of work that's always been done in this region on water and wastewater. The good type of work in DC Water exemplifies this with its national leadership presentations like that slide on relative risk that helps tell the story. We need to be prepared there. Specific to PFAS, think about this for a moment, just as an example. It was in 2020, the General Assembly in Virginia passed a bill. It was contested but passed, that mandated that the Virginia Department of Health, which had never before adopted an MCL ahead of incorporating the federal MCLs and 50 years of that program, with no added resources, not people nor money, the General Assembly passed a bill that said, congratulations, Health Department, you are commanded to adopt MCLs for the top handful of compounds that we've seen on most of the slides today. Despite being just not staffed to do the types of science, human health risk assessment, technology evaluation, and cost benefit analysis that EPA is tasked with doing, and overall does pretty well. Although I had to chuckle at the EPA cost numbers, those can't possibly be right. I think probably those of you in this room, if you put your future costs together, could well dwarf the numbers that EPA said are a national number. That number is a little embarrassing in terms of being an actual representation, but that'll improve with time as more information comes forward. Right now, we have in Maryland an MDE pause on issuing new permits for biosolids land application. Okay, a pause on new permits sounds like a selective ban of sorts to me. So there we are. We're back in sort of that mode. Now let's hope this is not permanent. The stated basis is to acquire more science. And hopefully, we're allowed to continue using and renewing existing permits and such, but it's a troubling concept. It sounds, maybe there's a scientific component to that, maybe there's a management component to that, maybe there's a political component to that to say we're doing something. I don't know what the exact reason for that is, but those things all come to mind. I'm not sure which. I'm going to jump to the right-hand column for a moment. Rosa, yeah, thank you. That was the best presentation on the basic chemistry behind this I've ever seen. I've sat in a lot of conferences and things. I guess I hadn't caught one of yours yet. That was really excellent. Thank you. Chemical manufacturers. This is where a lot of the action has been now. I'm jumping back into who can do what to help. Chemical manufacturers. There have been two types of activities chasing chemical manufacturers. Basically, in a tort law perspective, product liability type litigation. Down in federal district court in South Carolina, we have literally now hundreds of cases being brought against the most prominent manufacturers of these chemicals. You know, DuPont, Chemours, 3M kind of top the list, but there are some others out there. That list continues to grow every day. I know that 2022, Baltimore City filed, late 2022, PG County filed. Just within the last couple weeks, one of our clients, Charleston, South Carolina, which was the lead plaintiff in the national wipes litigation, they have just filed. That's started kind of some interest among some of our clients, particularly in some of the southern states, and I expect more. In fact, we've come to the point we're now recommending that everybody should just get into the South Carolina case, because it looks like that could shape up to being a place where a significant amount of the available resources from the targeted chemical manufacturers that put these products out there. And by the way, they're being pursued on theories of defective design, failure to warn, negligence, a couple others. This is product liability litigation, organized and being managed by some of the top tier plaintiffs type firms in the country that address all the national type issues. I would not be surprised if what shakes out of that down the road is some type of large national settlement pool. So if you haven't looked at that already, I think and people have had different questions about whether that's right for me, and it may not be right for everybody depending on your individual circumstances, but that deserves a fresh look to see if that's right for you, because it's happening, and it's probably going to lead, after a couple bellwether cases get tried in the middle of this year, which is the schedule, depending on how those go on causation and some other key issues, this is either going to head favorably in direction of those who've been impacted by PFAS, or it's going to head off favorably in the direction of the manufacturers and protect them. But we're going to get a read on that, maybe the middle or latter part of this year, and that'll be an important read. Upstream sources. There are a lot of different things we could say. We've been saying through the morning, there are a lot of things we can say about upstream sources. Pursuit of upstream sources is becoming more necessary. The regulators are trying to do their part. There are things that they'll be well equipped to do. There may be some things that they're not best equipped to do. Impacted water supplies, you're going to find yourselves increasingly needing to do something there yourselves. Maybe that can be some type of a partnership with your state or your state regulatory agency. Also on upstream sources, the thing that as I see more and more numbers on different facilities, source water numbers, but also finished water numbers out of our water plants. There are a few unusual situations, I would say unusual, but there are some situations where the numbers are way too high. Something needs to be done. In fact, a lot of those facilities we have a number of clients, you have friends in the industry. I don't think we've had to do much of this year, but they've jumped right into a project to install a PFAS barrier. There's been a lot of granular activated carbon installed here and there around the country in the last few years. With these 4 PPT, PFOA, and PFAS numbers, how about all the facilities out there that are sitting at 5? Sitting at 5. Let's assume EPA finishes this rule in a year's time. You got 3 or so years to get it done. That's basically yesterday in our industry. You need to have started already to have a chance of getting there. But what if you could just get that 5 to 3.9? You don't need to rip apart your capital program and do a GAC project that you weren't planning to do right now. And like Dr. Lee was just saying, source reduction. Well, several people said this morning, source reduction. Are we not going to get the benefit of that Are we going to jump straight to upgrades to finish in 3 years? This is just a project management kind of comment more than anything else, but I have clients who are doing compliance projects of various kinds on fixed schedules right now. Clean Water Act, Clean Water Act mostly, that are absolutely struggling to get done. Bids coming in way too high. Engineer takes their prior estimate, they update it, double, 50, and they go out for bid and still come back and surprised yet again at how high the number is. Just terrible climate, right? No one needs me to be preaching that in this room. Terrible climate. So what are we going to do? How many hundreds of wastewater treatment plant upgrades are we throwing on that pile right now? Did anybody notice inflation? Did anybody know? There are not enough great engineers, and there are full of great engineers at AECOM and Stantec. But I'm sorry, you guys don't have enough to design all these projects and get them done for us in just a few years' time. Is this going to be our national policy? Just adopt a regulation, tell everybody to do in 3 years, and we'll see how it goes? Doesn't make any sense. The nutrient business, which is kind of one where we had this common thing across our region, we all wanted to do nutrient control, get it done for the Chesapeake Bay. Through the different programs that we've had, the BRF program in Maryland, the WQF program in Virginia, we really phased out that construction over about a 20-year timeline to take us from, there were various levels of nutrient control to start for either or both of the two key nutrients. But we went from either none or levels of 12 or 8 to basically levels of 3 milligrams per liter nitrogen. It took about 20 years to do it. We're going to do 4 for these at all the plants everywhere, not just here, but nationally in 3 years' time. I don't think it can happen. Seems like that regulation could be set up, timed, tiered, phased, something to provide a better structure. I had citizen groups on the chart. I do think that's really low, but we do need to be mindful, particularly when not when we're on the receiving end on wastewater, but we're on the water supply side. We are putting a product into everybody's homes ourselves. I used the phrase in a different context earlier, products liability. I think our risk is low, but we need to be the good managers that we are. We need to understand the problem. We need to communicate the problem. We need to take reasonable actions to address the problem, and we'll be okay. That's not to say that none of you won't be on the receiving end some point down the road in that. I hope not. Maybe in this region, the chances of that are very good that the answer would be not. But the risks are out there in that category. I think they're just low. So I guess with that, that's sort of my my walk through some of the legal and regulatory policy and litigation issues that I see out there. I'm not sure, Lisa, how we're running the program, if our next speaker's ready or any questions.
Maybe if you could take 1 or 2 questions from the audience if we have them.
Mike Nardolilli, the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. For many years, I was in insurance coverage litigation. I guess the question is, some others have called PFAS the mother of all torts because of its potential for explosion in terms of bodily injury claims and environmental. Have you had any exposure to insurance coverage cases involving that?
Yeah, personally, no, I won't touch an insurance coverage case, but I know that there is advice out there, and it's prudent advice to look. Years ago, the carriers all learned to write pollution exclusions for their policies, but with every new situation that comes up, it's prudent to take a look at your old policies and your current ones for the different theories of liability. And there are experts out there who can do that from legal side, from historical documentation on coverage, finding policies that existed back in time. These problems, right, they go back basically to the 40s, was said earlier this morning. So there could be a lot of older responding policies out there. So it's a serious question. I am entirely incapable of addressing it well beyond my advice to do check into it if you have some liabilities here. Thank you, Mike.
She has a question.
Hi, Allison with Renew. Chris, I thought you had a really good point about the cost benefit analysis of upgrading the plant and capital versus investing in source control. I know that at the federal level, they have set aside some funds through the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act to address CECs. Do you know if those federal funds pretreatment source control programs, or is it only for capital upgrades?
Yeah, so I don't know that I know all the details on what might be used. I'll say loosely in a category of technical assistance. If you look at the bigger bills on the capital funding, a lot of those are traditional capital projects that are eligible under the two revolving loan fund programs. So clearly capital there. There have been, trying to think of the examples that we've seen. Allison, I'm going to say that I don't know the details, but I would phone a friend, one of Jeff's peers in the clean water finance, to see if there are any slivers of that that can be used for investigatory purposes rather than capital. And that's what I would do if I were trying to fund that. Thank you.
My communications hat and ask a question. As we are all endeavoring to communicate, I don't remember the speaker's name that said that, but to sincerely educate our stakeholders and customers about this, do you have any, risk or pitfalls that you see in terms of what we should avoid in our messaging, or just, in your examples of previous history, things that went awry for good intentions, but they, got the messaging wrong, that you would suggest we not repeat?
Yeah, it's a very challenging space to communicate in, the space that we all work in, right? I think as an industry, it's been fun to watch us all get better over the last couple decades at this. A lot of our utilities have communications professionals now, where there was a time when we didn't, and that was a mistake. So number one, making sure we have the right people speaking. That can be, it's a challenge for, gosh, I was on a team exercise on Monday for something new that was breaking, and we had general management, we had engineers, we had scientists, communications professionals, lawyers, and getting everything reduced to one paragraph or two that would be suitable for media release. What an exercise. It can be painful, perhaps for everybody involved, but necessary. I think the mistake would be skipping it. Mistake would be skipping it. And maybe I'll have a second part to my answer that will draw on what I distinctly noticed in Chris Piatt's presentation today. Chris has been as you all know, a champion and outstanding leader on biosolids quality across the industry. Brian, I enjoyed the Piscataway project is right there as well. But I'm going to stick with, I'm thinking of your slide, Chris. Chris had that relative risk slide, but I also noticed that he said repeatedly, I just want the science to lead where it goes. And while the costs are higher, I'm not particularly concerned about that. I translate that as we wouldn't want to waste the ratepayers' money, but we will also do what is prudent or required. So Chris wasn't selling anything today. He was sharing his knowledge, and the knowledge is, I'll say, imperfect in the sense that there is more that we will learn about this topic. So honesty in all aspects of this, whether it's communications or policy making, different aspects of our management, honesty, protecting our integrity. We can't get it back once we lose it. So any precaution that goes in that direction, I would obviously suggest as well.
Thanks, Chris. I am going to throw out one more thing to his list on communications, which is transparency. Showing the public your data, communicating that you're doing this work, asking public questions and working with other agencies. The transparency part of that is really crucial as well. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you all.
All right, our next speaker, who is up online, is Carolyn Byrne. She's the Legislative Director for Sustainability for the National League of Cities. So she really has a good understanding of kind of the municipality aspects of this. Carolyn leads NCL's advocacy, regulatory, and policy efforts on financing, water and air quality, climate change, energy efficiency, brownfields, solid and hazardous waste, which is quite the portfolio. Carolyn got her master's degree from American University and her Bachelor of Arts from Trinity in Hartford College. Are you ready, Carolyn?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you see and hear me?
Us? We're ready to go. We got your first slide up.
Okay, great. We can actually go to the second slide.
All right.
Happy to be with everyone today. Thank you for having me. So the National League of Cities is the voice of America's cities, towns, and villages. We represent more than 200 million people. We work with 49 state municipal leagues, and we are a resource and advocate for 19,000 cities, towns, and villages. At least 50% of our membership is considered a small city with a population under 50,000. And we can go to the next slide. NLC works to strengthen local leadership, influence federal policy, and drive innovative solutions. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so I thought I would just take a step back and say a little bit about NLC's work around PFAS, because we have actually passed a resolution on this issue, which has been helpful in our advocacy efforts. So I think this goes back to about 2017, 2018. Many communities across the country were becoming aware of the PFAS contamination. There was a growing concern across all levels of government about health risks and how to address the issue. At NLC, we were hearing a lot from local leaders who were also hearing from their constituents with questions about, is the water safe to drink? Is the food safe to eat? And within city governments, there were a lot of questions about the risks and how to communicate that to the public and how to treat water and remove PFAS. I know you've talked a lot about all of these things today. But because of this growing concern, the NLC Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee and our Military Communities Council got together to study the issue, and ultimately we developed a resolution. Some of the provisions are on this slide, and this resolution was passed by NLC members in 2019. There were a lot of convenings happening around this time. There was a national summit from EPA in May 2018. There were a series of visits to communities, including one that was hosted by our New Hampshire Municipal Association. And it was really also around this time in June 2018 that the CDC released a report saying that the PFAS chemicals could pose a health risk at levels that were lower than what was currently recommended by EPA at that time. So with this growing chorus of concern, Congress administration began to act. And it was a little bit like the chicken and egg, who was going to act first, Congress or the administration? And there were really competing interests between Congress and the administration, and also within the administration between EPA and the Department of Defense. And this led to some of the legislative and regulatory actions that we're seeing today. So we can go to the next slide. So in May 2019, again, just taking a step back, there were more than a dozen bills in the House and Senate addressing PFAS, and a lot of them were bipartisan. The bills were about surveying, regulating, mitigating, but there was really a focus on the CERCLA provisions and the national primary drinking water regulations. The bills were setting really strict and prescriptive timeframes for EPA to take action that were superseding the regulatory process, not waiting for that formal determination on whether to set a maximum contaminant level, but saying it must be done and it must be done now. And EPA had already begun the process of establishing a drinking water regulation by taking that first step of determining if the agency should take action. And then if yes, step 2 is really about what action to take. And then another major question was about whether to take or require action on the whole class of PFAS chemicals or just the 2 that were most studied and well-known, PFOA and PFAS. And within these conversations around forcing regulatory action, there was also talks of providing funds. So we had a infrastructure bill from Energy and Commerce Committee, which is really a precursor to, I think, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or Build Back Better Act, with some funding for communities affected by PFAS. And there was also funding and appropriations going towards cleanup at DOD, and also really towards veterans' health. So we can go to the next slide. So the various congressional bills came together in a bipartisan bill called the PFAS Action Act, which NLC and others opposed in 2021. But there was actually a version of the bill that passed the House in January 2020, but NLC did not weigh in on that. So what did these 2 bills do? There were 2 main points that we raised in our opposition letter, and you can just see an image of that right there on the slide. You'll see a large coalition. Some of those representatives, I think, are probably in the room with you all today. But the bill would, the bill would require EPA to designate PFOA and PFAS as hazardous substance under CERCLA within 1 year, and to make a determination on designating all remaining PFAS within 5 years. These designations were intended to make sure polluters are held responsible for paying for the cleanup in contaminated sites, which we of course support. But as the bill was structured, it would have also meant that municipal drinking water and wastewater utility ratepayers would face staggering financial liability to clean up the PFAS that was legally disposed of in the water treatment process, and not to mention other municipal facilities like airports and landfills, and I'll talk about all of this in a little bit. And then secondly, the bill would amend the Safe Drinking Water Act by requiring EPA to promulgate a national primary drinking water regulation for PFOA and PFAS within 2 years. This would establish a unique and expedited drinking water contaminant regulatory process. Again, EPA was already working on that. It would have eliminated EPA's discretion on whether to issue the drinking water health advisories related to PFAS. And we really felt these changes would have undermined the development of the transparent, science-based drinking water standards. And really that was probably one of the core reasons for our opposition. So what's next for PFAS legislation in the House and Senate? We don't exactly know, but the House and Senate committees are working on legislation. I imagine it will look very different from the PFAS Action Act, which never really had legs in the Senate, and now given the political shift in the House. But EPA just released the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation, so that's potentially off the table in terms of legislative action. But the biggest question for us, I think for local governments, is the liability issue. We have heard from congressional staff that there's hesitation on providing exemptions. Some say if you provide one exemption, you have to provide many. But on the other hand, this is again where that chicken and egg analogy comes in. EPA has said they don't have the authority to provide liability exemptions, and that must be done by Congress. But the agency would use an enforcement discretion when entering into settlement agreements with local governments. But this doesn't really provide the necessary shield, I think, for local governments when really we're looking at billions of dollars for communities and residents. So I'll turn it over. I'm going to talk about regulations in a second, but I do believe some of the organizations who represent what we call passive receivers of PFAS are holding a Hill briefing on Monday. So I can find that information and pass it along if it's of interest. Okay, and we can go to the next slide now. Okay, there are really two main PFAS regulatory actions that we're tracking. And again, this process started within EPA several years ago. EPA is acting quickly to finalize various regulatory proceedings, including these, by the end of 2024. The National Primary Drinking Water Regulation was released last week. As of last night, it hadn't been published in the Federal Register, but I admit I didn't check this morning. But EPA does expect to finalize by September 2024. And on the CERCLA designation, the proposed rule was released last September, and EPA expects to finalize this by August 2023. And so let me talk a little bit about each one, and we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So EPA is proposing a national primary drinking water regulation to establish legally enforceable levels called maximum contaminant levels for 6 PFAS chemicals in drinking water. I copied this chart from the EPA website, but I think it looks like a good kind of overview. So PFOA and PFAS as individual contaminants, and the other 4 chemicals here as a mixture, or what they're calling a hazard index. They're also proposing a health-based, non-enforceable maximum contaminant level goal for all 6 of the PFAS chemicals. The proposed rule would also require public water systems to monitor for these PFAS, to notify the public of the levels of the PFAS, and to reduce the levels of these PFAS in drinking water if they exceed the proposed standards. So to meet these standards, approximately 5,000 water systems would need to develop new water sources or install and operate advanced treatment. For states that already have existing PFAS drinking water standards, approximately 2,500 water systems would need to adjust their treatment systems and techniques. This will be very costly. It will require considerable investments, which ultimately get borne by the communities and the residents. And there is already facing, significant other costs related to infrastructure needs and requirements, including around replacing lead pipes. A recent study here, that's that link you see here, and of course, happy to have these slides sent out after the fact. But a recent study by Black and Veatch on behalf of AWWA, maybe the representative already shared this, but estimated the national cost for water systems to install treatment to remove PFOA and PFAS to levels required by EPA's proposal would exceed $3.8 billion annually. And of course, the bipartisan infrastructure law provides $10 billion over 5 years to address PFAS and other emerging contaminants, and certainly close to $50 billion if you look at all of the water infrastructure funding. But even in total, that would not be enough to meet the requirements, and particularly of this proposed rule. So we can go to the next slide on CERCLA. Thank you. So although this rule was deemed economically significant by the Office of Management and Budget, in our comment letter, we did not think EPA really conducted sufficient analysis. And really, we had a couple of different interests in this rule. So first, local governments serve as co-regulators in implementing and enforcing federal laws with states, including the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act. And second, local governments manage solid waste facilities and landfills and airports and other public service activities that would be impacted with this rule, including through unfunded mandates and cost burdens and legal liabilities. And we did not feel that the regulatory analysis or the cost analysis really addressed these or considered this. There was not a federalism consultation done on this rule, and we had substantial concerns on the impacts to municipal operations. So on the water utilities, we've talked a lot about this already today, I know, on treatment and technology costs, on the impact on biosolids and beneficial reuse. On the landfills question, I mean, what happens when a product that contains PFAS are thrown away from cookware, carpets, mattresses? You know, once these products get in landfills and the PFAS accumulates, it can be difficult to remove. Of course, the sewage sludge application here on the biosolids as well. And, you know, whether you're disposing in a subtitle D or a subtitle C, that can take the hazardous substance, really changing that calculation for landfills. And then on airports too, of course, you know, the firefighting foam was required use from the FAA. And unfortunately, you know, there had been runoff, and this is true for municipal airports and at military bases too, where that, you know, we saw water and soil contamination. So with all of these concerns and really lack of proper analysis, we did ask EPA to withdraw the proposed rule and conduct appropriate and required analysis and to consult with local governments. That did not happen. So we await the final rule. And so with that, I think I'll just stop. That's my last slide there, but I guess I'm happy to take any questions. I know I went through that fairly quickly, but you've been hearing a lot of talking today, so I'll just stop.
Thank you, Carol. And we do have questions, and I'm walking across the room to get to them.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the great presentation. I'm Jeff Seltzer. I work for the District Government Department of Energy and Environment. I'm just curious, do you know if anyone at the federal level was working at, you know, focused on more of the high-risk exposures to PFAS that were discussed in this meeting, such as food packaging, or is it really just focused on the water sector primarily?
It could be part of the EPA national strategy on PFAS, because I think that is a fairly comprehensive strategy in terms of, you know, reducing use of PFAS, you know, finding those alternatives to go in our products, and then also, you know, the treatment and disposal. So I do think it is part of their strategy. You know, what the actual actions are around that, I don't know, but I imagine it's a lot around kind of R&D.
Thanks. I just want to pause and say, if you think about it, Jeff, to your point, they're regulating food packaging at parts per million, and they're regulating biosolids at parts per billion, and drinking water at parts per trillion. So if you think of where the risk is with that list, it's pretty significantly different in orders of magnitude. Other questions for Carolyn?
John Butts, Fairfax County. In terms of management and looking at all the different regulations involved, is EPA working, and I've heard that they have been, but I haven't heard progress, on human health water quality criteria? And that would be bringing potentially, because of the that it does bioaccumulate in fish tissue, that we could be looking at an even lower target at some point. Can anyone offer any updates on that, where we are? Because that affects how we address it in the wastewater sector, our discharge to surface water.
Yeah, I'm not sure, actually. I don't know if there's anyone else in the room that does know that, but that is a good point. And I will say I know several agencies have their hands in this. But water quality would certainly be EPA, but in terms of the health risks, it's CDC or HHS. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
Rosa?
So the discharges are going to be managed under the NPDES permitting, and the NPDES permitting guidance that the EPA has put, and the NPDES guidance that the EPA has suggested to states that manage those programs doesn't address a specific concentration, but does suggest that they are thinking about protection of surface water. The surface water criteria are in the strategic roadmap, I believe, are scheduled to come out in 2024. And you've seen some states already release some of those criteria. I am going to make a comment about fish consumption. There are some communities for which fish consumption is an essential part of their diet and perhaps culture as well. Those have a different criteria for protection, perhaps, than some of us who buy our fish at ProFish or something. And I want to also direct your attention to some of the studies that have been released on the concentrations of PFAS in commercial fish products. So you can go and look up actually fish sold at the main avenue in one of these studies, and they're not as alarmingly high, let's say. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't even use that term. I think you'll be surprised when you see that. Okay. But as far as the surface water, there's a lot wrapped in that also with just protecting the ecosystem. Yeah. So it's falling under the EPA is my point, including the fish portion.
So yeah, that's one of the dichotomies in this, is that the NPDES permitting can help keep major sources of PFAS out of water with discharge permitting, but it also then affects all of the water treatment groups too. Any other questions on the regulatory and legislative front?
Good morning. My name is Jim Woods. I'm with the City of Rockville, which operates a 8 million gallon water treatment plant on the Potomac River. Thank you all of the speakers for such good information this morning. And one thing that you mentioned is that the IIJA now offers a significant amount of money to address PFAS over the next 5 years. My question really to the entire room is, as a water utility, what do we do now? And more importantly, when do we do it to even access that money that is really only offered, at least committed to, over the next 5 years? Are we to immediately try to address our 5-year capital improvement program to incorporate treatment processes that will address PFAS? Do we wait for the rule to become final? What's the strategy of the other utilities out there that are addressing these concerns?
Maybe I'll just start. You're right. I mean, A, it's not enough. B, it goes through your state, so you have to apply through that process. I guess the good news is that the PFAS money is all grants, as opposed to the regular SRF money, which is a mixture of grants and loans, and primarily loans. So if my recommendation would be, if you haven't talked to your state agency about this yet, then you should. Year one funding, so that would be FY22, probably has already gone out from your state, but some states were doing it kind of all in one pot or 5 separate pots, really. So you just want to find out what their timeline process is on this PFAS specific money. So talk to your state agency about that. And to the extent that, you are able to get a grant on this, I think now is the time to do some of this work, because as you said, it's just a 5-year funding stream, and it's really not a lot. And for those communities that will get it, it will help, but a whole host of more communities are not going to get the money.
Thanks, Carolyn. I think we're going to close this out here and bring up Rosa Gwynn to tie up all of these threads and continue the discussion. I promise lunch is just around the corner.
So I made a few notes during our get together, and there are just so many. I'm not going to need my glasses. So many good questions and so many good ideas. I don't want to cut into any question asking time, but I did append this little slide deck. You can just go all the way past. So I like to accumulate PFAS myths, right? Because there's a lot of voodoo. PFAS are everywhere. Let's just stop saying that. The minute we say PFAS are everywhere, we can just give up the ghost of treating PFAS where they're a problem, right? PFAS are in a lot of places, but it's just saying they're all over the place. I think it causes people to give up hope for a solution that could protect them. So maybe that's a lecture more than a myth. There are benefits from removing PFAS from those significant exposure pathways. We talked about fish, we talked about drinking water, and we also talked about how biosolids and the subsequent fate of PFAS that might stem from biosolids probably are not an enormous exposure pathway. Which brings us to, and I'll have a comment later, there's a myth that PFAS can't be destroyed. We can destroy PFAS, we can do it, but we need to focus on doing this in a logical way. So incinerators have been shown to destroy some PFAS, but they also had this unfortunate problem that no one was really watching, but they probably were emitting these partially incinerated compounds. And I think I got that right. They call them PICs. So there's a lot of work being done on improving incinerators, right? So, and incinerators already exist, so that's really good news, right? You don't have to build something new. So maybe we can get across the incinerator question. There are lots of technologies. I work on one that's associated with commercial destruction, but those are only going to be effective in taking those. We talked earlier about the energy needed to destroy the PFAS. So what you don't want to do is waste that energy on something that can be managed more easily. So for example, let's say I have a PFAS destruction technology and you're giving me 2 million gallons of water per day with 5 parts per trillion of PFAS. What a giant waste of money to use the destruction technology on that. It's a waste of money. So be logical about it and let's think about that as part of our process. The myth is that we have to immediately address PFAS in drinking water. And I don't know if that's actually really a myth. It's this immediacy thing. We need to manage PFAS sources. You can actually do blending. We talked about that also with the biosolids. There are some things that don't require an enormous spurt of infrastructure change. They do require change. They do invoke a cost. I'm not belittling that. And I got to tell you, when we were listening to Chris Pomeroy earlier, the supply chain, absolutely, for the brains that are going to do designs for treatment, yeah, we're all going to get busy. We are waiting 18 months for vessels that contain PFAS treatment sorbents. So, 18 months today, and we don't even have a final rule. That's going to get longer. By the way, note to self, maybe you should start a business in building vessels, right? So wastewater treatment plants are a source of PFAS. No, they're not. They're just a point where we can control them, right? And I think we can all agree on that. What do we have on the next slide? No more myths. Oh, I wanted to share this slide because I had it when we were talking about biosolids management. This is a slide that shares what Michigan, the approach that Michigan took. And I think it's brilliant, and it's not only because AECOM is the consultant to the state of Michigan. It's because it is manageable. It is a way to manage, just like Chris Piot was saying, those industrial impacted biosolids separately, or sludges separately from those that are not problematic and have a tremendous use for society, right? And so, look at where Bloom falls on those tiers, right? So, we're talking about an ant's eyebrow compared to some of these bigger issues elsewhere. The nice thing about this approach, and I think we can go to the next slide, is that it fits into some of the things we heard from the fabulous and brilliant Linda Lee, who, by the way, she did the whole session wrap up for us when she said, solving PFAS at the front end is more efficient than at the back end. I should take out that little hyphen, but you get the point. I mean, she said it all. We want to, we're all talking about water and water treatment plants and potable water, and we've got to continue that focus on critical use of PFAS and what we consume and buy. So the EPA is focused on restricting those problematic PFAS, especially as it comes to learn that they are problematic. There are bans for use of that and import of those materials to our country. Okay, so we can't make them, we can't make PFOA and PFAS in this country, and we shouldn't be putting them into food products or food, many products, let's just say it that way. And then there are some PFAS that we really want. If you need a pacemaker and it's got Teflon in it, I'm telling you, you want the pacemaker. There are essential uses of PFAS, but we can limit the applications to those that really make a difference. And by the way, that's why we have societies. It's so we can manage the benefits and costs of these things. That's why we work together. We've got to focus on those upstream sources, right? I think we can all agree on that. We want to take it out of all the materials. We can't do anything about stuff that's already made it to a landfill, but we can stop putting all that junk out there. So vote with your wallet, either that way or pay higher fees for your water treatment. Your choice, right? Not all PFAS are the same. Let's focus on the ones that are highly problematic first, right? Either because they're so abundant or because they're so toxic, or maybe a combination of those two parameters, right? We have to be adaptable, and Linda Lee addressed this as well. We know that there are regulations now, and so for example, in Maine, they have banned biosolids application, and people are paying triple the tipping fees, and we're sending biosolids from Maine to Canada. I mean, it's just ludicrous. We have to be more adaptable, right, in understanding that. And, that's maybe an example of a pinch point, but we saw what Arizona did. They rescinded the ban, right? So there's an adaptability that we can embrace. Yep, not ready for that one. Oh, maybe there's a timer on the other one, but you can go back. We want to focus on the mass, right? We got volume and you got mass. 2 million gallons per day of water with 2 parts per trillion PFAS is not a worthy target when you have, I don't know, 1,000 gallons of 500 billion parts per trillion of PFAS. Focus on the mass. And keep in mind, in a wastewater treatment plant, most of the mass is in the aqueous phase, not in the biosolids, mostly in the aqueous phase. And by the way, aqueous phase is a lot easier to manage. And we just have to get better at measuring it so that we really don't have these question marks. When we talk about concentration, ketchup is not biosolids. We eat ketchup, we don't eat biosolids, right? And so that's why it's an interesting comparison. But what biosolids are doing is different from what ketchup is doing. So let's talk about exposure pathways. The biosolids are far less problematic than ketchup for very obvious reasons, but it all stems from exposure. Let's think about our exposure pathways, right? So, and then just get those data on those pathways, the data of those in the environment. And obviously benefits and costs are part of decision making. I have a little graphic on the next slide that I kind of like. So if you've got water with PFAS and you can run it through a concentrating technology, you're making money right there, because you can take that PFAS concentrated waste. Right now, you're only allowed to stick it in a landfill or deep well injection. You can actually incinerate it, unless you're the DOD. The concentrated PFAS waste, you can throw it someplace. Or what we have is taking those concentrated waste, running that through a PFAS destruction technology, which indeed uses energy. Indeed, that is something it does. And some of the technologies are listed. Incineration is commercially available, and the subsequent ones are at or near commercial availability. They will never be able to treat millions of gallons per day, period, full stop. Keep that in mind. And then, you know, the end product is a little bit better for all of us. I think that's, I don't know, I might have one more. Oh no, we're not going to go back there. All right. So, yeah, I had all sorts of fun stuff, but no, we're not going there either. So thanks a bunch. I think those are that's just some food for thought. I'm not saying anything that most of you haven't already thought about. There are still these and concerns about costs associated with it. But if we can take some of the mystery out of how we might manage this, we can resolve this. We can do it.
Wow, I hope you all have benefited from this summit like I have been. It has certainly been a host of information, and certainly I think we all took away the major point of today is that partnership and collaboration, sharing the data, making sure we're all informed, because this is a topic that is not singularly focused to one of us, but it truly affects all of us. And that joint unified approach will be best to resolving both the regulatory challenges, our potential legal issues that arise, but most importantly, ensuring that our customers and our stakeholders are educated and aware of how we are addressing this challenge. So I know you had opportunities for Q&A with each one of the panels, but we didn't want to omit any final questions that you all have that are burning. This is hopefully the first of many discussions and things that we're going to continue to do in partnership with each other as this process moves along. So don't think this is your only shot. You can continue to follow up with Lisa or any of us if you do have questions after the fact. And I did want to ask just a housekeeping. Are we going to share the presentations with the, okay. Okay, so everyone who registered will make sure that you get a copy of the presentations. But before I turn it over to the two most important things, closing and lunch, I'm sure right now, I just want one last call for questions. Well, if not, oh, Salil Kakar, come on down. We have a competitive advantage when we host, so all of our stakeholders get to come and ask questions.
Thank you. Just curious, how many of you have your ratepayers aware that there could be massive increases in their rates due to this PFAS? Now, we talk about this internally amongst ourselves. We talk to the legislators about it, but how many of the ratepayers, how many know that this is going to increase? It could double the costs for water. Anybody? Nobody's talked to them.
I raised my hand. You just couldn't see me online.
Go ahead. You've got the floor. Did you want to say something, or you're just proverbially raising your hand?
I'm just verbally raising my hand.
Okay. No worries. And I'll just add on to that. I think all of us are, treading the waters very cautiously so that we don't, raise alarms. But I certainly think, WSSC put that in their statement as well, just that we don't want to wait until the point of which the impacts will happen financially to start that message. We certainly know from an equity perspective, the more we can balance that out and educate our, legislative bodies who are dealing with those constituent concerns and have that awareness now helps us, especially on the customer assistance side when we're thinking about how to offset those things. So we're, navigating the waters very trepidly, but we're aware. So with that last question, I'm going to give a shout out to our CEO and general manager who survived the mayor's budget presentation and is able to join us. So thank you, Mr. Gaddis, for stepping in. And then I'll turn it over again to our faithful host, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, for hosting this important summit for us, Lisa Reagan.
Thank you so much. So a first bit of housekeeping, if you have to run out, please grab a lunch on your way out so you are fed and happy. I just wanted to say, first of all, thanks to DC Water and all of the COG staff that helped pull this together, and our members for turning out for this. We really appreciate it. There is every single part of the water program at COG is doing something with PFAS. We've got the biosolids studies. We've got the communications aspect. There's wastewater. So we're always here for a resource, member or not. And also, I really want to encourage you to talk to your water utility. Our utilities in this region are awesome. I'm totally biased, but they've spent a lot of time and work doing research, working on communications, and now, we need the help of the rest of the region to get the word out and to help us look for solutions. And there are solutions and things that we can do as a region. One thing, for example, would be procurement. Looking at things within your own jurisdiction where you could reduce the amount of PFAS products that you use. And I know Fairfax Water and COG have lists of the ingredients to look for that you don't want in a product. So that's one that's pretty, I think is pretty achievable. I also want to point out that interventions do work. So since they banned the 2 long chain PFAS compounds, blood levels of PFAS have dropped by half since that time. So getting the PFAS out of the supply chain and making sure that you're using the less toxic options actually does benefit your health. I think that I'm really happy you turned out because I think doing this regionally and at scale is super important. Of course, I'm going to say that I work at COG. But I just want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Mr. Gaddis and DC Water for all of their work with the facilities. And with that, find a water person, anybody who's got water in their title or their organization. We're happy to talk to you as much as you want. So thank you very much and enjoy your lunch.